everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma 221 here, back in today, talk about Weekly Shonen Jump, issue number 45 of 2024. And off rip, this may be one of the best issues of Shonen Jump I have really ever read in my life. Today, we have 16 series to get through, and really, out of all of them, I think about 12 of them may be some of the most hype chapters that we have gotten out of their respective series. Now, that means, yes, there were about 4 stinkers that weren't, like, amazing by any means. I still think this week of Jump is, like, absolutely stacked. Was everything, like, the best it could be? No, but even the stuff that wasn't, like, the best of all time were really solid continuations of their respective storylines. Like, as we'll get into it here later, like, I didn't think Kill Blue was particularly good like normal, but I think it had a little something to it, maybe. I also like with Hakutaku, like, it was interesting. It's like a 3rd chapter, but, like, it was a lot better than what I viewed last chapters, for instance. But, like I said, we have a lot to talk about today, and as normal, we're going to go through all of the 16 chapters I read out of Jump this week. Some of them we're going to spend a good amount of time on, others, as we'll get to, like, 3rd of Hunter x Hunter, I'm not going to be able to fully cover that chapter just because all of the detail in it and also me not remembering everything about that series. So we've got a lot of cool things going on this week. Of course, Jujutsu Kaisen ended last week, so that is no longer in the Weekly Shonen Jump stuff I read. But of course, with that, Hunter x Hunter also resumed in the magazine. And with, of course, Hunter x Hunter resuming, I barely remember anything from the whole Succession War arc and the whole thing of like, oh, hey, we are heading over towards the Dark Continent and all that sort of stuff. I barely remember any of that stuff that's actually going on in the series. So I read the chapter. I think it's pretty interesting, but I don't remember the full context of it. So I definitely need to start a reread of the Succession arc of Hunter x Hunter because of that. But at the very end of this video, of course, as normal, we're going to be ranking all 16 chapters from worst to best, what I thought the best chapter was, and of course, what I thought the worst chapter was, and everything in between there. And also, we'll be picking a character of the week, the character I thought did the most, like, damn, that's pretty cool, and pretty much who was the most valuable character this week, all things considered. But with all of that out of the way, I really don't see any reason why I just don't need to hop into it. Oh, one other thing, the Shonen Jump issue cover this week is just One Piece. As normal, One Piece sometimes get the covers, and this week is a One Piece week where it got it. It's a fine enough cover. We pretty much just see, like, there's a sort of like a painting, like, portrait frame in the background, and we just see Luffy standing in front of it. He's got on, of course, a straw hat, and he's got on some more, like, regal-looking garb around him. It looks pretty cool, but it's sort of just one of those things where, oh, look at that. One Piece has a cover. Neat. But as I was getting to there a second ago, let's start up, of course, the regular, hey, talking about Shonen Jump with, of course, none other than Undead Unluck, chapter number 225. This chapter's titled, I Want to Get to Know. And of course, last chapter we had the whole thing where, okay, the whole Ragnarok battle is starting. We saw at the end of last chapter, pretty much Shikara is holding off Sun using an unbreakable shield in front of him. We see that Sean is also there with him, and a bunch of the other Union members have gone off to these various planets to help attack all of the 10 Master Rules, of course, that sort of relate to their whole sort of thing. And of course, on the ground, we saw that Fuko and Andy were getting ready to face off against 2 Master Rules. We'll learn in this chapter that those rules are, of course, Death and Luck. So, of course, Undead and Unluck. Really, who would have seen this twist coming? I think it's also something that we had known at least a little bit so far, but pretty cool to see. We pretty much start off this chapter with Death pretty much saying, like, hey, so you guys are trying to take on each 10 of us superior rules. Your plan is not misguided. However, it is impossible because you lack the sole means of conquering us. Without injustice, you do not stand a chance. Injustice's presence. Let this battle persist to the 101st loop. Pretty much saying that, hey, without the power of Juez, or I guess now the power of Julia in Injustice, you guys are sorta a little bit screwed with this whole idea of, yeah, this was the only reason you were able to make it this far, and now that you don't have it, you're not going to be lasting long in this battle. And we pretty much see this as all of the people are looking And we pretty much understand more of this fact as we see Luck comes up and starts to attack, of course, Fuko, Unluck, going back and forth. So Luck pretty much says like, hey, you guys should use the artifact Remember, that way you'll get all of your memories, and that would make this battle act a little bit better, right? As we sort of cut inside of the main HQ, where we see that Nico and Julia are standing in front of this like massive screen showing all of the different battles currently going on. And we see that Nico's looking around at all these battles. We see that Gina is fighting Unchanged. We see that Rip is also fighting Sick. And we see during this confrontation that Sick is sending off some of its juniors to go around and attack Chikara, of course, who is currently holding up the unbreakable shield of Unmove, of course, with Sun's attack here. And we see that the juniors are sort of looking around for Chikara, but of course Sean is there, and Sean, being unseen, is able to like block all of that off. And Fuko is sort of taking note of all of this stuff going on, is just looking around and like, yeah, this isn't looking great whatsoever. We just see more images of Unchanged fighting Change, Gina fighting Change. We see that Billy and Tella are, of course, fighting War. Shin and Mui are against Time. Yusai is against Justice. And then, of course, Latla and Rip are fighting against Sick, right? And Fuko's just thinking like, damn it, we're not going to last long at this rate, right? As Def pretty much just says like, hey, do you think you children can beat your parents? Which is a very interesting line for the whole idea of, okay, yeah, this makes sense because, of course, Unluck is fighting Luck. Def is fighting Undef. Or Def is fighting Undead. I don't know why I said Undef there. I guess I was sort of just like in that mindset, like, all right, yeah, it makes sense. Change versus Unchange. Billy's Unfair and Tella's Untel against War, because that was sort of how their powers manifested. I also like the battle going on between Shin, Mui, and Time, because of course Fang's whole thing was Unfade, dealing with his perception of time. Well, not really his perception of time, but just how time affected him. It's a really interesting little way of sort of setting up all of these battles. Granted, I think Yusai against Justice will be more of that whole deal of Unjustice will come in, but either way, Def's whole remark of just the idea of, hey, you children think you can beat your parents is very, very interesting, right? Well, at this point, Fuko pulls out the Remember card out of wherever she's been holding it, right? And we pretty much see a bunch of characters who are like, hey, like, what's going on here? And like, Andy's like, are you actually going to be using that? As, of course, Fuko yells out to Julia, who's, of course, inside of the main base with Nico, right? And Fuko just is like, Julia, listen up. It's time that you've made up your mind. The you who stands here now is a result of the former undead, the person who loved you, Victor, giving his all to reach you. You are his final gift. And Julia's like, give, like, I don't understand. But Fuko just is like, hey, I trusted in your version of justice and dragged you into this fight, because I thought that's how it should be. It would be all too easy to use Remember now and to tread over Victor's kindness. But I think that the answer lies in you taking on his affection as your current self. So what will it be, Julia? And as Julia hears all of this, we see that Fuko sort of thinks in the background about all of the times in the past where we'd seen interactions between Julia and Victor and sort of their whole relationship. As Julia just screams out, I want to remain myself and get to know that person. So sort of understanding here that, okay, Julia is not going to turn back into Juez. That's not how this is going to work. Julia is going to manifest the power on her own, right? And Andy pretty much just says like, hey, Fuko, you hear that? We don't need to run away from this situation. And Fuko just gives a little smile saying like, hey, then it's decided. And Fuko then just yells out to all of the various union members, 10 minutes, we'll buy you guys some time. Don't rush to take down your targets. Focus on gathering intel and buying time first off. Creed, Phil, Engine head to the round table. We see that the three of them all start to head there. Fuko then yells to Nico just like, hey, Nico, go take Julia somewhere. And Nico's like, hey, wait, you're not talking about I think you are. But Fuko's like, hey, isn't it illogical, Nico? And Nico's like, yeah, but you see, as Nico's like, hey, if only we took the orthodox path, we wouldn't be here now. As he's like, all right, Julia, let's go. As we see that both Julia and Nico hop on some of Nico's floating balls and start to sort of move around the whole area, down to the shaft, all the way to where the round table is sitting, right? And at this point, Luck just asks Fuko, like, hey, I thought you guys were going to use Remember. Are you not going to use it anymore? But Fuku just says like, oh no, don't worry, I am. Once the final piece is in place, that is, right? And Defton just says like, hey, I'm not naive to let that come to pass. As all of a sudden we see that Def starts to spawn their own juniors, right? We see that Nico and Julia are making it down the path to the round table. As all of this happens, Def's juniors come through and start to attack them. Right, at this point, Creed, Injin, and Phil all arrive there, and Nico pretty much says, all right, we'll fend off all of these guys. Julia, you go down to the round table, right? Julia starts to head down, and Julia just thinks to herself like, hey, thank you, everyone. I'm off to see everything, and through his vision of justice, I'm going to find it. My own vision of justice. As we see that as Julia heads down all the way to the round table, we see that she takes out her sword, and she goes through and starts to point it at none other than Apocalypse. As she just screams out, Apocalypse, those memories ingrained within you, I'm going to take them. And that's where we end off this chapter of Undead Unluck. Just really cool, really high octane, all the way through. Just really, really awesome to see this sort of happen, go through see sort of the build-up of the chapter, all of the sort of fights going on against all of the master rules, eventually building up to this thing of like, yeah, we are going to get injustice. And how are we going to get injustice? Between, of course, Apocalypse. And, of course, that dynamic between Apocalypse, Victor, and Julia, or Juiz, that we have seen plenty before in the 100th loop of the series. It's just a really cool thing that Undead Unluck's doing here, so hats off to you, Yoshifuma Tezuka. Great chapter, all things considered. Next up, then, is One Piece chapter number 1128. This chapter is titled RPG. So yeah, a role-playing game. I wonder where that's going to come up in this chapter, but we, of course, being that One Piece had the cover of Shonen Jump this week, we just have, of course, a regular just like, hey, One Piece double-page spread. We see all of the Straw Hats are there. We're not actually all of them. We see that it sort of like looks like a sort of Harry Potter sort of universe where like Luffy's flying with the aid of a broom. We see there's a massive dragon in the background that Jinbei is lounging around on. We see that Zoro's also sitting on this dragon. We see that Usopp, Sanji. We don't actually see Nami here. We see Robin, Frankie. Actually, we do see Nami. Nami's riding on a broom with Frankie. And we all see Chopper and Brooker all there. So pretty much all of the Straw Hats alive and accounted for, just doing their regular things. Cool color page. Nothing really too important to what actually happens on in this chapter, right? Of course, last time the Straw Hats had gone through and ended up pretty much beating and figuring out all of the stuff in the Big Stein Castle as we learned what it was. And at the very end of the chapter, we saw the original 5 Straw Hats were all reunited. We saw that Sanji, Luffy, and Zoro came in and helped out Nami and Usopp while they were pretty much not looking too good, right? Well, pretty much this chapter just goes through a whole bunch of like theories about what's going on with the Straw Hats, where they are currently. Zoro pretty much explains like, hey, he woke up on one side of this place and he eventually heard some noise, and it was, of course, Luffy who was beating the crap out of the Ear God, that big rabbit that, of course, we know that they beat up and all of that sort of stuff. Apparently, Sanji found Zoro and Luffy sometime during then. Usopp then just sort of starts to have a little bit of a brain blast. He's just like, hey, here's what I think. In my view, these are Elbaf warrior clothes we have been dressed in, but there's no way that Elbaf, the land of giants, would have clothes specifically made for our size, right? And Nami's like, so you're saying this is Elbaf, but maybe we've been turned into giants instead? As she sort of goes up and touches one of the trees, and she's like, but this isn't a real tree, so I don't actually know if this is Elbaf, right? As we pretty much see all the Straw Hats just talk some more. Zoro's like, hey, I think there were maybe some people in town. Maybe we should go and ask them to try to get to the bottom of some of this. Luffy's like, hey, you're right. Let's go ahead into town. Sanji's like, hey, if the other members of the crew are here, it's probably not all of them. Like, something may be going around here. And pretty much Usopp's like, hey, Sanji, how can you tell that some of the crewmates aren't here in this area? As Sanji pretty much explains that Robin's not turning up on the me radar, right? And Nami's like, really, Sanji? Are you serious about all of this? But as all of this happens, all the Straw Hats start to march off towards the town, and as they're heading that way, they eventually run into this giant, supposedly, who's riding a massive grasshopper, right? And everybody's like, whoa, look at this grasshopper. The grasshopper's got on, like, this Viking helmet, and the helmet has, like, the motorbike handles attached to it. It's a little bit of a funny, interesting thing, as a few of the Straw Hats are also like, oh no, they're bugs, like, what is this? This is a little weird, right? But pretty much this guy just is like, hey, sorry guys, I'm in a hurry, no time to sit around and talk, but I can tell you this. All of this vast land you see belongs to the Sun God, and they're like, Sun God? Like, what are you talking about? And this giant just says, like, hey, I serve the ruler of Big Stein Castle, Master is Cat, right? And they're like, oh, wait, there's a person at the castle? And he's like, no, it's just a cat. And Luffy gets ready to say, like, hey, I beat up that cat, but everybody sort of, like, silences him, like, Luffy, damn it, like, you don't need to be doing this right now. And as they're doing all of this, they're like, hey, this is my... The giant's like, hey, you might call this the land of gods. He's like, hey, I'll be leaving now. I'm sure the Needle God, the hedgehog, is also looking for food. Nami sort of makes a little bit of a face because, of course, she killed the crap out of that hedgehog last time, too. And then pretty much the giant just says, like, hey, I'm running a little bit late because, I'm running a bit late to feed all these animals because of the ear god. A giant rabbit was found burned to death outside the town. All of the other Straw Hats are like, oh yeah, we killed that thing. And of course, Usopp has to, like, put a hand over Luffy's mouth to, like, keep him from talking and blabbing that, like, oh yeah, I killed that thing, right? But then the giant just gives one final piece of advice to the Straw Hats, like, hey, and let me warn you, you must never venture in the other direction from the castle, right? And Luffy's like, oh, why not? As the giant just says, like, hey, the Sun God's temple is there, guarded by vicious soldiers. None have ever approached the temple and returned to speak of it alive. And everybody's like, whoa, what's going on? And hearing this, Luffy just dashes off in that direction, right? And all the Straw Hats are like, get back here, damn it, right? And everybody's like, hey, well, old man, thanks for all the advice and stuff, right? And the guy starts to sort of head back on in his way as all of the Straw Hats start to head off towards this direction to follow Luffy towards this danger in some sense. We then see that the guy riding on a grasshopper eventually makes it closer to Big Stein Castle, and of course see some of the rubble, but we don't end up seeing the fall out of all of that, right? Luffy is then just running towards this direction, and as he's just running on, all of a sudden, it looks like there's somebody running towards Luffy in the distance a little bit. And as Luffy just keeps on running in this direction, he suddenly crashes into a wall that's actually a mirror, and the person he saw running towards him was actually himself, right? Well, this mirror pretty much cracks, like cracking sort of the skybox of this little place. And everybody's like, whoa, what's this happening? It's just so weird. As all of this glass sort of cracks and shatters down to the ground. And we pretty much see that outside of this, as we then see... As all of this glass cracks and falls to the ground, we see this interesting little diorama of that there's a little door here, and that presumably all of the Straw Hats are currently stuck in like a toy box of some kind, right? As Nami's like, oh, this is currently like a giant-sized room, what in the world? Zoro's like, hey, we're not inside an Elbaf ship, are we? Usopp says like, yeah, no, they had no cabins in those like this, so what's this going on? And there's also an exterior netting covering this whole glass case too, right? Sanji's like, hey, so if there are giants on the other side then, we're nothing but pets in an enormous cage, right? As all of a sudden a little voice starts to yell out from outside the cage, all the Straw Hats go over, and they find that Chopper is there on the ground, right? So now all of the original 6 Straw Hats are all together. So I guess that means that either Frankie or Robin are going to be the next one to be found, being that, I forget who is actually next, like who joined the crew. I think it's Robin because of her whole thing, like, of course she was traveling with Straw Hats first, and then during all of the Water 7 stuff, she said, like, hey, I don't want to die, and all of that sort of stuff, and then we had the whole events of, like, oh, okay, Frankie is going to be traveling with the Straw Hats after all of the Water 7 Indies lobby sort of stuff going on there, right? We see that Usopp sort of, like, investigating this room here, as he's just like, hey, so these are human-sized clothes in a giant's room. Like, are they supposed to be dolls' clothing? As we pretty much get the idea that, yes, inside that box was sort of like an RPG sort of, like, area of some kind, right? as Luffy also looks around like, hey, there's just all blocks around here. Like, this is so weird, right? As Sanji just says, like, yeah, that's what the kingdom was made of. And when we roasted that rabbit, there was a nasty smell that it made, which was probably because of the synthetic resin that was also burned whenever we sort of burned the area, right? So, yeah, of course, plastic smoke or plastic fumes do not smell good, so it makes a whole lot of sense here, right? And Sanji just says, like, hey, we'll just look at that. The edges are mirrors that made the scenery seem to go on forever, so it made it look like we were in a bigger world, right? As we pretty much see all of the Straw Hats turn around and look back at this sort of cage, as they see this is a one-way mirror, is that from the outside, you can clearly see through it, and on the other side, it is a clear mirror. So, pretty interesting for sure, right? And as everything pretty much just goes on, Zoro just says, like, hey, so basically some giant with poor taste decided to build a kingdom of blocks and toss a bunch of humans and animals in there to sort of see what happens, right? And they sort of all are just debating on all of this, as Nami eventually says, like, hey, but the only thing we really know is that a giant did this. Like, we really don't know anything else for 100% certain, right? And Chopper's like, yeah, we need to go outside, be sure to make sure everybody else is safe. Like, we need to get out before supposedly the giant that put us in here comes back, right? Usopp then says, like, hey, maybe we should go back into the box and go into the town and sort of, like, ask around. Maybe we get some info. Maybe this person's, like, a big weirdo or something. Like, hey, we want to avoid friction with the giants if at all possible. And, like, isn't that right, Luffy? As all of a sudden, this massive snake appears in the room. And, of course, Luffy is going to fight it. There are a bunch of mice in the ground, a raven overhead too. And all of these animals sort of see the Straw Hats and look like they're getting ready to attack. At this point, we cut outside of this room to a hallway where we see somebody, a giant presumably, is walking through the halls. We see that they've sort of got this interesting, like, cloak on, and they seem to have like a deer skull attached to their head as sort of like a mask of some kind, right? As pretty much we just see a bunch of yelling and screaming going on inside the room, as this giant sort of walks up and sort of starts to go and unlock the door. And as he opens it up, he just screams like, what? My sacred temple! As he sees just all of the chaos going on in here, we see that Luffy's in Gear 5th, doing Luffy Gear 5th shenanigans pretty much. And we pretty much see that they're messing and beating up all of these things. We see that Luffy uses a Gum Gum Dawn pistol on the snake, doing a good old punch to it, right? As this giant just yells out, no, human Glada, what's going on? As pretty much was like, hey, Luffy, hurry, we need to get out of here, there's a giant in here now. And like, that giant also seems especially huge, like, what's going on? It looks very creepy. As all of a sudden they're running around, they see the cat that they beat up earlier, presumably the captain of that thing. We see that Luffy gives it a good old punch, and all the Straw Hats hop on the back of it. And the cat pretty much starts to run away from this whole situation, as the giant behind him just yells like, hey, how dare you bring ruin upon my kingdom, like, what's going on here? And all of the Straw Hats are just sort of bickering back and forth as all of this is going on. And as they sort of head back into the toy area, into the sort of RPG game, they're pretty much like, hey guys, hold on, if we run straight ahead, we might hit in our mirror, but if we break through, it will be on the outside of it, so let's do that. Yeah, it's time to escape, right? We see all the citizens of the town inside of this RPG are just like, oh no, the Sun God did a divine fury, what's going on around here? As we pretty much just see the Sun God just say, you all shall not escape. And that is where we end off this chapter of One Piece. Yeah, so presumably this is like a tiny world inside of the regular confines of Elbaf. This is like very interesting to what's going on here. Presumably this Sun God presides over them, so a lot of like interesting stuff going on here, but in typical One Piece fashion, none of it makes really good sense at all. But also I really like the Sun God's design so far, sort of with that sort of like deer antler sort of mantle, like it really looks really neat. But the next chapter up is going to be a very quick one because, as I said, it is Hunter x Hunter, or Hunter x Hunter, chapter number 401. This chapter is titled Moonlight. We get a nice little color page for Hunter x Hunter here. It is of some character who I do not remember whatsoever, I am sorry. And then we see the whale ship that everybody is traveling in on the bottom of the page. I wish I remembered more about Hunter x Hunter. So, pretty much, as I alluded to, being that I do not remember most of the stuff going on in Hunter x Hunter, and that, as most Yoshihiro Togashi chapters, this chapter is incredibly dense and lore heavy. I am not going to be able to like fully go through and sum up the plot points in here in a way that it makes coherent sense. I mean, we see Kurapika talk with one of the supposed other bodyguards of the 5th prince, and they pretty much sort of end up making a deal of some kind, and yeah, it's a lot of weird nin stuff and nin contracts, and people outside are like, hey, this is taking too long. It's a lot of that stuff where I just need to reread this arc to sort of understand more about it. Really, I think the most interesting thing at the end of the chapter is that we see beyond Netero is chained up to a wall somewhere. I don't know if we remembered that he was like this or if he wasn't, but we pretty much see that he's sort of chained up, and one of the 12 Zodiac people are in there talking to him. And pretty much beyond Netero asks like, hey, there's somebody I'd like to talk to. Can you arrange a meeting? And we see this is day 10 of the voyage, Tuesday at 2 p.m. So, yeah, there's really not a whole lot more I can say about this chapter. Yeah, was it deeply interesting? Yeah, for sure. But will I probably get more out of this chapter after I go and do a reread of the whole Succession War? Yes, also. So, a lot of various things going on in this chapter. I did enjoy it. Like, I picked up on a few things that I sort of remembered, and it came back to me. But being that Hunter x Hunter is like, yeah, we may get chapters, like, I think the last chapter was just over, like, probably 22 months ago. It doesn't really help for me remembering everything going on in Hunter x Hunter. So, good chapter for sure, but I'm just not really qualified to talk about all of the various small parts of this, right? And then we immediately go to another very quick chapter for me to recap, because this is Kagurabachi, chapter number 52. This chapter is titled Just the Two of Us. And of course, I do Kagurabachi chapter reviews on the channel. By the time this video comes out, I probably won't have my video up on Kagurabachi chapter 52 up yet. But because I do like a big, long, deep dive video talking about Kagurabachi, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about it here in these videos. Just go check out those other videos instead. I'll have the playlist to the Kagurabachi chapter reviews not only in a card on this video, but also in the description down below. So go check out that playlist. But to pretty much sum up this chapter, we cut away from all of the stuff going on over at the Senkutsuji Temple of Samura and all of that sort of good deal. And we head back over to where, of course, Chihiro is fighting Hirohiko. We see the two of them sort of get ready to go back and forth. Hirohiko pretty much goes on this whole thing of like, hey, I'm 18, same as you. We could be really good friends. Like, I've been sort of entranced to the world of death since I was 3 years old. Like, we could be really good friends. Chihiro just goes to, like, go through attack. He's got a Nishiki. He has a Nishiki cloak on his blade currently, and he just goes through with that sort of piercing attack motion. Hirohiko then uses their paper origami powers to sort of just disappear into the various wind, as Chihiro is now left to deal with all of the other Danseki sorcerers surrounding them. We see that Hirohiko heads over and goes into a sort of play area where we see that the Battle of Sano Island will begin shortly, and we see that Hirohiko takes a seat in the audience, talks with the person beside him. It's a little bit of an interesting interaction, as Hirohiko is just like very blunt about everything, because like the guy they're sitting beside just is like, hey, your stomach, it's bleeding. And Hirohiko's like, oh yeah, it was just a guy with an enchanted blade who cut me. Like, you should probably watch out for it too here soon, right? We see Chihiro is fighting with all of the various Danseki sorcerers. We see all this battles going on a rooftop, and while of course it's on this rooftop, Chihiro and all of the various Danseki sorcerers become on top of the building that this play is currently happening on. So Hirohiko makes an arrow with of course, her origami, and Chihiro sees this and sort of leads down into the ground, where Chihiro pretty much dispatches one of the Danseki sorcerers at this point, right? And they pretty much Chihiro ruins this whole play pretty much, as blood splatters against everyone. Everybody sees that Chihiro cut the heads off one of these people, and they all start to run, as Hirohiko just says like, hey, you're unscathed, Chihiro. And they're just like, hey, you feel it, don't you? To the average person, you're currently a monster. And Chihiro's like, no, I mean, whose fault is that? Who set up this whole scenario, right? But Hirohiko just says like, hey, don't you see, I'm the only one. I am the only one who can understand you. As Hirohiko just continues to sit perfectly calm in the audience, in their seat of the play as all this happens. And hearing all of this, Chihiro's like, alright, just cut the bullshit. And he literally just says like, hey, cut the BS. And that is where we end this chapter of Kagurabachi. Really awesome, really fun chapter through and through. I will have a dedicated video up on this chapter decently soon. It'll probably be in 2 or 3 days after the release of this video, because I'm trying to get this video up by Tuesday the 29th of October, which, yes, is about a month or 3 weeks after these chapters were initially released, but hey, I'm sorry, that's how me recording videos sometimes goes, especially Shonen Jump videos that are very long. They aren't always the most coherent and on-time things, but it sort of is what it is there. But really great chapter of Kagurabachi. Hopefully the video will be out by Thursday of this upcoming week, the 31st. I guess it'll be a Halloween video on the channel, but pretty neat there. Kagurabachi, good as always. Next up is Ruri Dragon, chapter number 22. This chapter is titled A Direct Hit. And let me just get it out right now. This chapter is so nice and fun. Like, this honestly may be the funniest chapter of manga in this issue, because I laughed so many times while reading this chapter. Just so much fun little comedy baked up into it to where it's really just a really great time. Well, we of course start off this chapter with, of course, Ruri Akoi and her mother sort of sitting around, and we pretty much see that Ruri's mother is going around and pretty much taping up some bandages on Ruri's horns. She pretty much remarks like, hey, these are some nice clean breaks. So of course, last time there's the whole thing about, yeah, Mieda and Ruri broke off Ruri's horns to sort of show it to some of the members of not only her class, but also the Sports Fest people, the committee, whatever the actual name for it is. I can't really remember it right this second. But we pretty much see that they're talking about how like, oh, hey, these are some nice clean breaks. And we see that Akoi's mother is pretty much just like bandaging up the horns. And she just says like, hey, these were your baby horns, I guess. And of course, they're like baby teeth. The next pair that you grow in will be much stronger, right? And she says like, hey, going forward, we'll do the breaking at home if we ever need to break your horns again, right? And pretty much the whole idea is, Akoi's mother just says like, hey, so right now your stubs are protected from air and sunlight, and the cross sections are all covered up. So that should prevent new horn growth for a little while anyway, right? And Ruri's like, hey, could we not like just keep the horns like this forever, like bandage up so like they don't grow? But Ruri's mother just says like, hey, forever we can't do that. I mean, it won't do you any good to stifle their growth for too long, right? And Ruri's like, oh, come on, like we can break a few rules here, right? But her mother just says like, hey, the next pair would grow in all wonky, and we don't particularly want that. And even worse, if we don't let them grow, it could become another symbol of imbalance and trigger more misfires of your draconic traits, right? And her mother just says like, hey, it's important to take the form the way that you were meant to be. Like, we can figure out all of this in the future, which really comes more of that fact of Ruri Dragon is this coming of age tale. Like, hey, the dragon horns will reflect who you want to be, so just let them grow. So a little bit of an interesting thing, right? We then see that all of the skies are cloudy as Ruri goes outside to head to school for today. And of course, on her way to school, she meets up with one of her friends. I think it's Yuka is her name, but I could be a little mistaken on that. I don't really quite remember this character's name 100% yet. But of course, seeing this, Yuka's like, oh wait, what happened to your horns? Because of course, she did not know all of this stuff was going down, right? Of course, Ruri heads to school, and the same thing happens there, as all of her classmates are like, oh, hey, Akoi, is that really you? Like, what happened to your horns? And Ruri's like, hey, they just got annoying, so I ended up breaking them off, right? And everybody's like, are you okay? Like, that seems like a really big deal. Like, you broke off your horns? And I love one of the classmates just says like, oh no, our cryptid classmate is now ruined. As Ruri just says like, hey guys, relax, they'll grow back in eventually. And some of these guys just like, okay, that's good. Really, really funny just the way that they do this. Like, they're honestly more concerned about Ruri having horns and being like a weird anomaly of nature than about her well-being, which is a little funny, but I know that they're doing this out of like a caring for Ruri pretty much, right? We then see Ruri goes into the bathroom. We see that Mieda is also standing there with her. And the two of them are sort of just like talking back and forth. And Ruri just says like, hey, everyone's acting like my horns were like my trademark or something, right? And Yuka just says like, I mean, you have to remember, your horns did have like a little bit of a fan base in our school. Like, you should have expected this whenever you broke them off, right? Yeah, her name is Yuka. Ruri does say it here, right? But Ruri also says like, hey, but I'm also feeling kind of sick. And Yuka's like, hey, is it like your tummy or your intestines or something? And Ruri just says like, no, neither. It feels like our venom reaction. And she says, apparently I'm going to feel under the weather until my body adjusts, but there's going to be no more vomiting going on at least, right? And Yuka pretty much gives the whole idea of like, hey, even though you are a human and you have these draconic traits, your body is not adapted to all the venom. So even though you're a human, you're still getting a little poison, and that's sort of this imbalance that's going on with you, right? As Ruri just says like, hey, I guess that's a toll of the dragon part of me, right? And I love Yuka's reaction of, man, this just keeps getting weirder and weirder. Like, what are dragons even fighting out there? So, a little bit of an interesting note there. And at this point, Ruri and Yuka are heading out of the bathroom as all of a sudden, we see that Mieda and one of the other members of the club committee suddenly start to run over and like, hey, Akoi, over here, you got a minute? And like, really get her attention, right? As we pretty much cut over to the club room where we see that a typhoon is getting ready to hit Japan. And when would this typhoon hit? But on the day of the sports festival, as we pretty much see that this is going to be a direct hit, sort of the chapter title naming here, this hurricane or typhoon. I call it hurricane because I'm American and I live in the area where we call them hurricanes. But in Japan, I know they call them typhoons, so, but they are really the same exact thing, like, oh no, high and low pressures in the ocean, like evaporation happens, and oh no, wind blows in circles and stuff, and they're not a very good force in nature. I mean, that's what recently made all of my videos become very delayed, is the hurricanes that hit the, southeastern, or, yeah, is it eastern? Yeah, southeastern United States. So, I've gotten some experience with hurricanes recently, so this is a little bit of a big deal. It doesn't seem like to be a very strong storm, as the whole club members explained, but it is still a direct hit, right? And they pretty much explained it, yes, the storm's going to hit on the day of the sports festival, so we're just going to have to cancel it. There's no postponing it or doing anything. Pretty much the way the school schedule worked out this year is that it was like a really, really tight schedule going on here, and one of the girls just says like, yeah, there was no wiggle room this year, so we're sort of just screwed here, like we're sort of just sitting ducks. They're pretty much explaining like, hey, it's really a shame after all of the work that we all put into it, but it really is what it is, like, hey, to make sure we can use them for next year at least, we need to bring in all of the materials and decorations inside so none of it gets ruined by the weather. And also, like, the tents need to get folded up and all of this stuff before the typhoon hits. Yes, they call it a typhoon here, even though, like, I'm reading this done in America, but yeah, whatever. Akoi pretty much just looks outside as all of this is happening and is really bummed out because, yeah, it really sucks that this whole thing that she's been focusing on for so long has now just been canceled, and everybody else who put in the effort is like, yeah, that sucks. We then see Ruri sitting around talking with all of her friends, sort of like during a free period at the school, and they're pretty much talking like, hey, yeah, that really sucks, like, yada, yada, yada. And as all this goes on, one of Akoi's friends just say, hey, can't a dragon do something about this? And Akoi's like, huh? Like, what are you talking about? As the friend just says like, hey, I mean, I don't see why not. I mean, dragons are meant to be super powerful creatures and masters of the sky, right? And Ruru's like, are you, like, serious in asking me that? Like, you must be expecting a lot from me, who's just a teenage girl in all of this, right? We see that Yuka's like, yeah, but it's really not totally impossible for someone like you, Ruri. And Ruru's like, I don't know if I'm supposed to take it as, like, an insult, or as, like, as an insult as, like, something nice. Like, come on now, right? But then one of her friends just says, well, then, Ruri, well, what about your father, then? And, like, isn't your father a dragon? And Ruri's like, I mean, yeah, he is, but what do you mean? And then she just says, like, hey, couldn't he just blow away one measly typhoon? A really interesting sort of plot idea that's going on here. We then see that Ruri and all of her friends sort of call up Ruri's mom, and pretty much we get the explanation of Ruri's mom saying, like, oh, yeah, I mean, of course your father could blow away a storm. He would be able to do it with one of the 9 traits. And Ruri's like, you're kidding me, right? Like, that cannot be a real thing. As we pretty much see that Ruri's mom just says like, hey, well, calling off lightning is one facet of that overall draconic trait, which you could sum up as like weather control in general. But she just continues saying like, hey, except demanding he do something is another story in its entirety. And Ruri's like, well, you care to explain? As her mother just says like, hey, Ryu and humans have found a way to coexist. Part of that deal was the former vowing not to wield their very own powers. So dragons, or I guess Ryu as they also call them, are not allowed to act all willy-nilly. And everybody's like, huh, that's really interesting, right? And I love Ruri's thing of like, were you never going to tell me any of this stuff, right? And her mother's just like, hey, it's kind of complicated, but I'd be happy to give you the basic rundown if you are curious. And Ruri's like, maybe another time, right? But we pretty much get the whole idea of her mother just telling Ruri like, hey, Ruri, why don't you actually do all of this, right? And Ruri's like, hey, am I even capable of that? And Ruri's mom just is like, hey, I mean, you sure are. There's nothing that your dad can't do, so you'd be very able to do it too, right? He was like, you already dealt with that static discharge earlier, so you may be able to do it. And hearing this, Ruru's like, well, you say I can do this, but can I? Didn't you just say there are like rules and regulations against all of this going on? And her mother just is like, all right, here's the thing though. You aren't a dragon. You are a human, so you're not barred from doing anything whatsoever, right? And she just says like, hey, if it were up to me, you'd have free reign, but technically speaking, it's up to your teacher. As everybody's like, huh? Like, what do you mean, our teacher? As we didn't see all of the various characters are now in homeroom, and they're all talking with their teacher, who I think his name gets brought up. Yeah, Mr. Takamoto, right? So everybody's talking to Mr. Takamoto, and Takamoto's like, yeah, you guys, that's right. I'm actually here to monitor the special advisory capacity, right? And everybody's like, what the heck? Like, you mean you're here to actually just, like, monitor a koi? Like, this makes no sense. As Mr. Takamoto just explains, like, hey, well, I'm more tasked with managing her presence, but you guys, this only stays in this class. This does not go out to any other part of the school, right? And the students bring up, like, yeah, okay, well, he's actually a first-year teacher here, so is he actually even qualified to teach us stuff? Like, what's going on here? Takamoto then just explains, like, hey, I was assigned to this post in case of real emergencies with a dragon-human hybrid living here. But I do have a full and up-to-date teaching license, so you guys have no issue, like, hey, I'm still everybody's favorite Mr. Takamoto, right? And everybody's like, okay, then I don't know if I agree with this, right? But eventually we get more to the point of like, okay, weather control, what's going on here? We see, I think her name is Kashio, maybe? It's Ruri's friend with the two-toned pigtails. Pretty much is like, so, teacher, so about this whole weather thing, what's going on about it, right? Takamoto just says like, hey, the topic of me can wait. Aside weather pudding is possible, you have to go ahead to do it, right? As long as under the guidance of the school administration and myself, right? And some of the students are like, so you mean a koi can actually go through and blast away the storm system? And we see that Takamoto's like, I mean, yeah, that is probably asking way too much. But she should be capable of something just as effective, at least in theory, right? And he says, of course it comes with some risks, and as a teacher, I'm a little hesitant to encourage this course of action. But Ruri just sort of looks up, she got a little bit of a shine in her eyes. She's like, hey, please, Mr. Takamoto, I want to. We all worked so hard this year to prep for this. The committee all worked so hard to prepare for this Forest Festival. People like Maeda, Shiota, and everybody who worked on the art. And if you say it's possible, then I want to put my dragon powers to good use, right? And Takamoto's like, of course you do. And he's like, well, this is kind of wild. And some of our students are like, yeah, this is absolutely insane. Like, are we really going to do this? And Drew's like, wait, so are you guys actually okay with me changing the weather? And everybody's like, all right, heck yeah. And everybody sort of like goes up and like gangs up on a koi. Like, we see that Kashio comes and like give her a little bit of a hug. As Takamoto just says like, hey, no time to waste in drawing up a plan. This is a big deal, so we best strike while the iron's hot. And that's where we end off this chapter of Ruri Dragon. This chapter was so fun on so many levels. Like, I laughed out loud so many times whenever the whole idea of like, hey, maybe Ruri, maybe you could deflect the storm. And then like a whole idea of like, oh yeah, you have 9 draconic traits. Like, it sort of gets like dropped like it's absolutely nothing, but That's one of the parts I really love about Ruri Dragon, is sort of that like nonchalantness that exists at a certain point. It's really, really funny. I'm like, all right, you literally have a dragon-human hybrid that goes to this school, and half the time, most of the characters like, okay, that's cool. It's just really, really funny to me. And then the whole thing of like, all right, Mr. Takamoto, you're actually just like some government official who's actually here to look after Akoi with some stuff, but you're also a teacher. There's so much comedy to this chapter, and it's going to be awesome if Akoi is able to save the sports best by using draconic powers. Such a great chapter through and through. I absolutely love Ruri Dragon. The next chapter is going to be the sort of final short chapter talk about here in this issue of Shonen Jump. We're, of course, talking about Kill Blue, chapter number 72. This chapter is titled Nice One, Ogami. So, to get into this chapter, of course, last time we saw that Otagami had ended up on the back of Yatsurugi's horse, and Yatsurugi is not very happy about this. We sort of get a little bit of a flashback of how this happened. Pretty much we see it as Otagami got knocked off of his horse. Shin pretty much stuck up his foot into the air. Otagami landed on it, and then Shin pretty much gave Otagami a little bit of like a propulsion kick to get him back on one of the horses. And the horse he ended up getting back on was, of course, not his own horse, but was Yatsurugi's horse, right? Pretty much Yatsurugi's not very happy with this. We see that he does a little bit of like some combat stuff, ends up trying to put a spear point right through Otagami. Otagami captures it with his like bare hands. Yatsurugi then pretty much goes through and just sort of like tells a little bit of a story about like, hey, I am elite, so like you think I'd be able to attack just because of my high social class, right? And then Otagami sort of makes like a really bad pun joke. There's a whole page where pretty much all of the characters reacting to this, and they're all drawn in like really crappy like doodle art lines. It's a little bit of a funny thing, I guess. I don't know. This wasn't a great chapter of Kill Blue, all things considered. But just go through all of this. Yatsurugi is just very like not happy with this right now. Tries to knock Otagami off his horse by doing some big moves. At this point, one of the other guy they're facing, Domiki, throws over some objects to Yatsurugi. Yatsurugi catches them. They're none other than brass knuckles, and he goes to sort of get in a fist fight with Otagami. Domeki then pretty much explains like, hey, don't be fooled about that's who Yatsurugi really is. Like he's done a lot of crazy weird stuff. Whether it's fighting sports, what makes a man strong is competitive nature, and deep within a brutally violent heart, Yatsurugi can stand up against me even in a fist fight. And of course, Domeki's whole thing is that he is stupid powerful, right? At this point, Otagami sort of calls over his horse to over near him, as we see that Yatsurugi's like getting more of the brass knuckles. Otagami hops off the horse and moves over onto his horse, of course, Tashi Noken, who's of course Norin's horse. And pretty much we see that both parties sort of split off in different directions, riding their horses in various different positions, and they're getting ready to line up and face off again, as we pretty much end off the chapter where Yatsurugi's just like, hey, you are truly the most infuriating person I've ever met, Juzo Otagami. Seeing you grovel before me will no longer be enough. And Otagami was like, hey, getting you upset wasn't really my intention, but I guess how things have got to end. And you know, I've been getting pretty used to writing, so let's settle this already. And that's where we end this chapter of Kill Blue. And actually this portion of the recording, since I've actually now got to go to one of my college classes, but I will be back later to talk about, I think we got through 6 chapters, so we have 10 left, so yeah, we still got some more manga to talk about, but I will be back actually. Well, actually first, I thought this was a fine chapter of Kill Blue. It was okay, it wasn't great. I mean, a stupid little joke there. I'm honestly considering dropping Kill Blue depending on how the end of this arc is, just because it's barely interesting. But like I said, I now actually have to go to a college class, so I will see you guys right now. All right, and we are now back. So of course it has been like 5 hours or so since I last recorded that. Actually, it's been a whole lot longer than 5 hours. It's been closer to 6 hours since I recorded that last section, talking about the first 6 chapters of this week's Shonen Jump issue, which means that we have 10 more to get through. So I'd say let's not dilly-dally any further, and let's hop into Ichi the Witch, chapter number 5. This chapter is titled Fifth Hunt, Shira Bidona, the Antillic Witch. And this is a very, very fun issue of Ichi the Witch, as we'll get into. A lot of really fun and a lot of interesting things that get brought up in this chapter. So we start off this chapter, of course, with Descaros and Ichi heading into the main building of the Witches Association, pretty much. As we pretty much see that as they walk up, there's this sort of magical mirror that sort of just asks him for like, hello, what is your name, right? And Descaros responds with, everyone's favorite uber-talented badass, Descaros, and also one guest, right? And then the mirror sort of repeats this as like everybody's uber-talented badass Descaros, or everybody's favorite uber-talented badass Descaros. Name and voice print verified permission for migrage passage granted. As we see this mirrored and sort of like unfurls its tongue into a staircase that then, of course, Ichi and Descaros sort of walk up into the main room of the sort of Witches Association here, right? Inside of this building, Ichi is very much like, whoa, this ceiling is way too high, like, what's going on with this place? It even takes note of the floor, like, and the ground is all stone too. What is this pattern? I've never seen wood like this before. Like, this is so interesting, what's going on here, right? And I love how Descaros just, like, calls him a little bumpkin, being that is really what Ichi is, all things considered. And Ichi's like, hey, can I carve out, like, a chunk of this and, like, keep it with me with my knife? And Descaros is like, no, you can't do that at all, right? Well, as Ichi sort of is checking out the ground here, all of a sudden, a little bit of a boot comes out of the floor, as it's almost like a sort of puddle with like whenever you would drop a droplet of water into water and those sort of ripples that appear, those ripples appear in the floor, and out of it comes a woman pretty much. And first off, we see this boot. This boot has like two little eyes inside of it that almost look straight into Ichi's soul all much. As all of a sudden, this witch appears completely from the ground, as she enters and just says like, Sha Chikila, right? And she's like, height 5'5", body fat 11%, weight 102 pounds. Well, aren't you the sturdy musclehead, healthy and flexible too? Plus, you really do have magic power despite being visibly male. Wow, look at this, you're totally incredible, right? As pretty much this woman just starts like, hey, I'm here to feed my own eyeballs, but I still can't believe it. All right, now you need to strip down and I need to examine you naked, right? And Ichi is seeing all this like, okay, who are you? What's going on here? As we see another woman appears out of nowhere and comes and sort of pulls back this woman a little bit, right? As this woman sort of just like holds back this other person like, all right, come on, you need to calm down for a second. That's everything's going on, right? And pretty much then a few more of these people all appear. They're all wearing the same sort of uniform. They've all pretty much got these sort of like beret hats almost. And then they have like veils over their face that like reads like records, reports, assist, sort of showing that these people like serve a purpose of some kind and like there for facility management and that sort of thing, right? As pretty much this lady just says like, hey, welcome Master Descaros, Master Ichi. It's our honor to be your guide today. We are a society for research into the intricacies of magic and witches. That's a mouthful, so please call us the Witches Research Club. As Ichi recognizes the main girl here who's wearing a veil as the one from the mail cart earlier. Of course, her name was Komagi, right? And Ichi's like, oh, you're the one from earlier, right? And she's just like, yeah, that was me. And she approaches Ichi with something called a approach permit, right? And Ichi's like, what's an approach permit? What's going on here? And we pretty much learned that the main witch's master that we've seen her before a few times, but her name is Master Moneygold. And pretty much all of the witches wanted to see Ichi because he's an anomaly. So pretty much, it's sort of like a reverse restraining order. All of these witches cannot get within the vicinity of Ichi unless they have this form signed and filled out, right? And Descaros even notes like, all right, well, normally like this part of the Witches Association is massive and like bumbling with a lot of power and stuff going on. So I guess it makes sense why there's nobody currently here, right? As all of a sudden this lady, or as Komagi just continues like, hey, and over there is our club's supervisor, Shira Bidona, the Antillic Witch. So that is a person who sort of came up from out of the ground earlier. I didn't mention it earlier, but she asked Ichi for a piece of his hair, and Ichi did throw that over, and she's sort of playing with it in a ball right now. And Komagi just explains, like, hey, Persona with such a rare guinea pig, and she says, not a guinea pig with such a rare research subject. She lost her composure, our profound apologies, right? And Ichi's like, are all witches like this? And Descaros is like, no, of course not. A few more things happen as eventually Komagi, and I'm going to take a little while to remember her name since it's a little bit long, a little bit confusing, Shira and Dona, both lead Ichi over to this sort of magic restoration chamber, as they call it, right? And I'm going to get this eventually. Shira Bedona then just says, like, hey, all right, Ichi, you just stand there. And Ichi walks in over here, and he looks up at this magic mirror on the ceiling, and he says, oh, that's weird. Why is this chamber so tall, and also why is there a mirror up there, right? As pretty much Shira Bedona just says, like, hey, is everything all right? And he's like, nothing. And she just explains, like, hey, you have acquired the raiko magic, correct? And Ichi's like, yeah, I have. And she just says, like, hey, well, then use it for us. Ichi's like, how do I do that? And of course, we know that that magic stone that he got from it has inscribed the name of the creature on it. And Descross pretty much explains, like, hey, the word on that stone is the Raiko's true name. So because you acquired it, you're the only person who can read it, right? So Ichi pulls out his knife and sort of holds it in front of that target. As pretty much Shira Bendona, is that what it is? Yeah, Shira Bendona pretty much just says, like, hey, imagine yourself slicing that target there, then swing your arm and speak the Raiko's true name, its personal chant. As Ichi just thinks, like, right, I need to come and I need to swing at the target like I'm slicing at it. As we suddenly see that he's holding the knife out in front of him, and some magic energy almost starts to wail up around him, as everybody sort of looks in shock, as the Raiko magic appears in sort of like a ethereal form behind Ichi. Ichi sort of reels back the knife behind him and then swings it in front of him while saying, Inazuri, also translated to lightning call, as he sort of throws out the name at this, but instead of hitting the target, he actually hits the mirror on the roof instead, right? And everybody's like, whoa, wow, that's crazy. He actually made a magic attack, right? And Ichi sort of makes a note of, like, hey, it felt like I was swinging a great scythe, like it's very difficult to control, even though I was only holding a knife here, which is a little bit of, like, an interesting thing on, like, how the magic may work in this series. Well, Shira Bendonajin just says, oh, interesting, that's interesting. You're like, so you're the type who does things by feel, right? And she's like, magic power level seems average to one in women, and she's pretty much really inspecting Ichi, right? But she says, but here's the thing, you still triggered a spell without hesitation and purely off desire to hunt a target. You may be a novice at magic, but I see you still got a lot of experience as a hunter. How fascinating, right? And she pretty much just says, like, hey, but it also seems as long as you don't activate Oro Oro as your magic power, then you won't be asleep for 3 whole days. So, and also the Raiko magic's effect wasn't a mass explosion either, so it's a very good for Ichi, all things considered here, right? But she didn't just says, like, hey, but still, it is very odd. Why did you hit the ceiling and not the target? And she says, like, hey, if it wasn't a simple miss either, you clearly aimed for it, right? As Ichi sort of stares up to the ceiling and just says, oh, it was habit. Shira Bendona questions, like, habit, what do you mean? And Ichi just says, when I sense a powerful presence, especially a hostile one, my body just reacts. That is no normal ceiling. What is behind the mirror? As Shira Bendona's like, oh, you're quite perceptive, Ichi. And she's like, yes. At this very moment, on the other side of that mirror, the witches of the association are watching you, judging you. They're judging you to see if you're dangerous or not. You've proved that you are capable of using magic without hesitation. Will they see that as a weapon or arsenal, or as a potential threat? Everyone's internal balances are teetering, ready to go either way. For that reason, I highly suggest you do something about that. As she points back over to Ichi, where Ichi's sort of now sitting on the ground, and behind him, Oro Oro has formed into his sort of regular being form behind him, right? And everybody's like, oh crap, Oro Oro, what's going on here? As Oro Oro just says, like, hey, come on, Ichi, you're my partner. You see how these witches work now. Like, they're stuck you in this fish tank, observing you like a beast, looking for excuses to kill you. You cannot trust them. Forget your magic hunting, my boy. What do you say about the 2 of us? Do a little witch hunting instead. As we pretty much see that Ichi's knife has now been sort of imbued with a power by Oro Oro. Sort of, we just see like a few sparkles coming off the knife, right? As Ichi turns around to look at Oro Oro and just says, interesting. And that's where we end off this chapter of Ichi the Witch. This chapter was just hype, all things considered. We're learning more about the Witches Association. We meet a really interesting, weird, wacky character in Shira Bendona. Very interesting, and eventually getting to the whole point of, alright, Ichi uses the Raiko magic, and then, okay, all of the witches are looking at him. There's a lot of really cool witch designs. We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in specific. All very interesting. Some of them we get more of a look at, some of them we get more or less of a look at, so it'll be interesting to see a lot of these characters going forward, because of course, I mean, this series is going to run for a while, being the authors of it, and also just its quality at chapter 5, and also, like, the intrigue of, okay, what is Ichi going to do next, like, with Oro behind him? It's so interesting. I love Ichi the Witch. Next up is Shinobi Undercover, chapter 4. This chapter is titled The Joy of Clubs. Pretty much the whole premise of this chapter. I'm going to go through this one a little quick because there isn't like a whole lot to really talk about in it. Of course, Yodaka and his classmate, I think her name's Aoi, I think, or no, her name's Mukai, Aoi Mukai, if I'm not mistaken. So we see that Mukai and Yodaka are sort of talking with each other. Pretty much there's this whole idea of, okay, clubs are starting up around the school. Yodaka uses a cool ninja move to throw a push pin at a wall, sort of helping somebody put up a club border, right? And the operator just tells them, like, hey, don't do that. Yodaka then asks his operator, like, hey, who do you guys know who's after the assignment anyway? Like, you know how this is going on? And the operator pretty much explains, like, hey, it's very confidential stuff. Even in the ninja world, there are some who've sold information to the enemy or have disappeared on the middle of a mission. We call them fugitive ninjas, and we have no idea who might defect and when they might defect, right? There's a few jokes that are made at Yodaka's expense, like, hey, I don't want to defect, I can do no other job, right? Well, eventually, we see that Yodaka and Mukai sort of meet up again. Pretty much, Mukai just bought some bread from the student store, two of them meet up. As all of a sudden, there's this other kid who ends up dropping some bread and crushing it on the ground. And he sort of just like starts to yell like, oh no, not his bread. What am I ever going to do? As we see that Mukai and Yodaka pretty much trade their bread with this kid. And he just says like, hey, I'm Miyake, one of your classmates, right? And he pretty much says like, hey, I'm in a soccer club, but I'm pretty much your bitch boy. I am doing all of their various errands, right? And everybody's sort of just like talking about that, like, well, hey, why did you let him push you like that? And pretty much Miyake just says like, hey, that's because I really, really like soccer, right? Eventually, the upperclassman of the soccer club comes over and says like, oh, hey, my bread's there on the ground. Why did you drop that, Miyage? Like, what are you doing? Pretty much just showing the part of the series of, yeah, if they are older than our main characters in like an older year, if they are upperclassmen, they are absolute assholes to our main cast, right? So Miyake pretty much like apologizes to all of this, and Mukai just says like, hey, you shouldn't be like punishing this kid for all of this, like this is stupid. And eventually this guy pretty much just says like, hey, let's have a little bit of a friendly competition where we'll do 3 against 3 or 4 against 4, I forget what it is. And you guys need to play a soccer match against us to prove that you're better and we won't be treating Miyake like this pretty much, right? We don't see who the 4th person on the team of Mukai, Miyake, and Yodaka is, but we see that they're all sort of working together. Pretty much goes through Mukai falls down on the ground. She pretty much messes up a little bit. She gets hurt a little bit. So Yodaka has gotten clearance to use his powers to make sure that she does not get very hurt due to all of this sort of stuff, right? Yodaka does some pretty like ninja move stuff. And eventually it comes down to where they need to score one final goal. And Miyake looks like to be the one who can do it. But as he's running and chasing after the ball, his ankle twists a little bit and he falls to the ground, right? But actually coming to save the day so the higher up kids don't win, the upperclassmen, we then see that Yodaka comes in and throws a little piece of candy to the ball, pretty much acting like a jet propulsion device and spewing the ball into the goal, right? A bunch of cheering goes on as all of these first years do it, and like Miyake and Akoi are very happy, and like they all go around to each other and do like a massive high five and stuff going on, right? At this point, like, okay, the day is saved. There's a little bit of a joke between Yodaka and the operator, like, hey, clubs actually don't seem so bad, right? And the operator's like, oh man, you're a very simple guy, Yodaka. But as all of that's going on, they're pretty much just talking. We see that Miyake talks to Akoi and Yodaka a bit more. Yodaka and Mukai start to walk off a little bit somewhere, and as all this happens, we see that Miyake's demeanor almost starts to change a little bit, as he just opens up his phone and just says like, "Oh, hello, thank you for the help. Yes, there really was a ninja here at school today. Public safety must be involved, and that would explain all of the various failures. But he's the bottom of the barrel. I had no trouble approaching them, and he was full of openings. Please just leave it to me. Ninja slaying is a fugitive ninja's specialty. We can kidnap the girl later." This was fine. I pretty much, whenever I read this chapter and the whole idea of like, all right, hey, fugitive ninja, and then we get introduced to this other main character in Miyake, because of course we have the two characters that are sort of focused last time on chapter 3. They were interesting enough, and I would expect that maybe we'd get more of like a background on them and sort of building them up as like Akoi's bodyguards. But as all of this sort of happens, I sort of was able to tell this twist of, okay, yeah, Miyake is a fugitive ninja, and he is going to be the antagonist going forward for at least the next few chapters, if not the first maybe little arc of this series. So a little bit of an interesting thing there. I didn't hate it. I thought this was a fine chapter. Definitely not like the best chapter I've ever read of a manga out there, but still completely serviceable and like not bad whatsoever. But yeah, Shinobi Undercover, pretty good. Not too much else to say about it. Next up is another chapter that's going to go by pretty quick, and that is Hakutaku chapter number 3. Of course, last time we had the whole thing between, of course, Noto and Hikuma? Yeah, Hikuma. Of course, in the last chapter, we got the whole thing between Noto and Hikuma, where Noto pretty much said, like, hey, I'm bad at making games, so how about I enlist you to help me make games, and we can do a bunch of cool stuff together. And that's sort of where we ended that chapter off on. I really wasn't the biggest fan of last chapter, because I thought it sort of felt a little contrived and a little bit rushed in what this series is supposedly trying to be getting done. But as we'll see in this chapter, I thought this one was decently entertaining. So, but pretty much Hikuma has this whole thing of where he's like, wait a second, up until now, like, I never thought that's something we could even do. Like, I didn't even think I would be able to make more games. That's a little interesting, right? Eventually, Noto's mother calls down for her to come downstairs. As we pretty much learned, there's this guy named Masumaro from the electronics store, right? And he wants Noto to make him a game for a little bit of a shopping week deal thing that's going on around here, right? And we see that Masumaro pretty much explains, like, hey, I don't do anything flashy on a job that I can be involved with, plus I can't have food in the store, so I'm not really sure what I do for an event otherwise, and since I'm an electronics store, maybe if I had an electronic game, it would be really fun for something like that, right? And he pretty much says, like, hey, I knew you were making a game, right, Noto? And he's like, the shop gets the most votes, actually gets a prize also, so I was hoping I could enlist your help in winning this prize, right? Noto pretty much is like, oh, I bet you made a bet with someone that now you need to win, so you're coming to my help, right? And they're pretty much just have a little bit of a stuff going on between them, as eventually it gets revealed, which I think is the funniest part of this chapter, is we learn that Masumaro is like, I have fallen for someone. She's a single mother, and I'm trying to win over her son just so that I have a shot with her, right? And pretty much both Hikuma and Noto were like, I don't know if I like working for this guy, but if we can make a game, maybe we'll be able to do something, right? But Noto pretty much says, like, hey, I'm sorry, Masumaro, but I suck at making games. If you want something, you're going to have to ask him. Points over to Hikuma, and Masumaro's like, hey, who are you? And Hikuma just says, like, oh, I made a game with Noto recently, right? And pretty much Masumaro's like, please, help me make a game. Like, we need to do something. And at this point, we just see that Hikuma just sort of thinks for a second and just says, like, hey, how about, like, maybe a game where you have to find a dog and take a picture of it within 5 minutes or something like that, right? And you get points based on how good the picture is, but it would be unfair to judge them in person. If there's a prize or star, maybe it would rope some kids in. So he's sort of thinking about all of this, as Noto's like, oh, so we need some, like, image recognition AI and some other stuff. Like, maybe I could get some people to help. As we cut over, supposedly this is inside the Masumaro electronics store. We see that 2 other characters are now introduced. One is Mitani, a Tokyo University grad student who works with AI, and Nishikawa, a manager at a local company, right? Pretty much we learned that the grad student is going to be helping out some AI stuff with this game, and then the other person has like some connections, and they're going to be getting some snacks and some prizes and all this sort of stuff considered, right? Pretty much Akuma's like, hey, how do you know these people? And another really funny joke is Nodo's just like, hey, I ran into them a lot in a certain FPS, and she's like, yeah, we're all Predator ranked at it, which, okay, like, that's a little funny as far as, like, video game jokes go, like, ha ha ha, they're all Predator ranked, so they met each other over playing games like this. That's pretty fun, and, like, getting connections and online friends. I like that. I think that's a pretty funny little joke, all things considered, right? But pretty much as we continue, we see all of this works. They talk about using pre-made stuff, being this game, they need to be made in like a week. So if they use pre-made engines, they don't need to make their own. And as long as you're not trying to sell it and just use it as like a one-time thing, it's not going to be that big of a deal, right? They write the code. There's a little bit of another interesting note that like they have a specific programming advisor and also a tech lead, which reminds me a lot of Dr. Stone whenever they had Curate as science consultant, which I always thought was really fun and really showed like, yeah, that's interesting. But we see pretty much some code on the screen as it's like programming advisor, My Dearest Incorporated, tech lead, Junya Yamamoto. So, okay, fact checking this stuff, that's pretty neat. But as all of this is sort of going on, we see that Masamune, or not Masamune, what was his name? Masamaru, right? Just thinks like, hey, like, I know I'm the one who asked this, but I think these kids might make something even better than I was expecting, right? We now cut to the day of the event where we see that Nodo is pretty much outside, like, commanding all of these kids, like, all right, guys, now all you guys need to do is download this app, and, like, this is too much work. It's like, but there's prizes involved, right? And she just sort of says, like, hey, just bear with me a little bit longer. Eventually, as all of this happens, a bigger group of kids sort of starts to come around, and pretty much as all of this happens, we should see that all of these kids are, like, getting ready, and they're getting into it. They run around, take some pictures of dogs, and bring them back to this kiosk where Nodo's is like, all right, guys, 5 minutes is up. Any longer, and you'll be past the time limit, so be very careful, guys. They're like, all right, now let's judge this round. As you pretty much see, like, these people went and took pictures of dogs, and this video game pretty much just goes through and rates the pictures of the dogs, gives them a certain amount of points. You see a little bit of a cute image where, like, a dog is sitting there and, like, it's got its two paws up on a counter or something, right? And it scored 90.852 points. And then at this point, Noah's like, oh, good job, you got 90 points. We'll go over to this guy over here, and he'll get you a prize. This girl goes over, is like, oh, that's my picture. She goes over and meets with Hikuma. And Hikuma's like, oh, 90 points, that's really good. All right, you get to pick something from over here. And they pick it. We see that Hikuma has a very good time at this. And he is sort of on those brain, like, neuro overload things again. I almost was going to call him Masamune again. I guess his name is Masamaru. Then just comes like, hey, thanks for helping out, you two. I got you guys something to drink. We see that Akuma is sort of passed out on the ground as he's pretty much just like, oh man, like I was just so overloaded, like, oh boy, what's a little funny. There's then a little bit of a note that Fushikishi's son, of course, the woman that I want to call Masamune again, and Masamaru, didn't end up coming today. So it's a little bit of a thing like, all right, this guy who had some questionable morals didn't end up getting what he wanted, which is probably for the best, all things considered. But Hakuma just thinks like, hey, it would have been nice if that kid could have played our game today, though, right? As the two of them just talk like, hey, this was really fun, and I want to do it again. Like, I wouldn't have experienced this great joy twice if I was still out on my own. So he's like, hey, Nodo, would you still keep making games with me? As before Nodo can answer, two snot-nosed brats come over and like, hey, we didn't get a high score in your game today. When are you guys running it again? And Nodo just says like, well, here's the thing, we don't have plans to run it a second time, but the two of us will be making another fun game together soon. So just wait until then. And that's where we end off this chapter of Hakutaku, chapter number 3. So I think this was a fine chapter. I found it decently entertaining. Like, yeah, that whole thing of, what's his name? Masamaru. I thought that was a little funny, like, his motivation. I found it, like, a little bit of a funny joke. And also, this chapter is nice. We see more of, like, a development angle fast and off the rip, which is something that we didn't actually see in a series like Tenmaku Cinema, which is a reason I think that series failed mainly, right? But not really to get into that today. All things considered, though, this is chapter number 3 of Hakutaku, and I have decided to drop this series for now. Maybe if it continues on running for a little while, I may pick it up again, but just the fact of, like, I'm reading 16 chapters in Jump each week, like, some things like Kill Blue, I may be removing at some point just because it's like, I don't find it always 100% interesting. And even if it is like a renowned manga author, it's like, come on, like there's only so much I can do when you just introduce these characters like Domeki and the other guy's name where it's like, or Yatsurugi or something like that, where it's like, I don't care about these guys. Like, you already have cool characters in Tenma. Like, Tenma Tendo is the only reason I'm still reading Kill Blue, right? So it's like, there are some series I feel like I may drop, like, depending on how Shinobi Undercover's next 2 chapters go, I may end up dropping it, but like, so far, Hakutaku hasn't done a lot for me, and I don't really know if I want to continue to read it. But I think this chapter is good. Oh yeah, by far. I don't think there was a bad chapter this week, but it just wasn't that level, and like, at a certain point, I don't need to be reading 16 things in Jump each week. I like being around that sort of 12 to 14 range if I can sort of manage it, but still, I did not think Hakutaku Chapter 3 was bad whatsoever. Moving on now is Astro Royale, chapter number 24. This chapter is titled Kimpa's Wish. Of course, we start off this chapter with the whole thing last time of, yeah, we learned Kimpa's backstory and how her parents got really brutally murdered by Himuro, who is the Division 6 guy, right? There's a little bit of a talk between all of the various people as we see that Terasu's like, oh, so that's what you wish for, Kimpa, was just to disappear, to be weak and sort of disappear, right? And Ken Wakui, your style of writing is so weird sometimes, as this may be one of the most forced lines I've ever read in a manga, as Ruri, of course, here's what Terasu just said of, oh, so that's what you wished for, Kimpa. And Ruri follows up, an astro born from sadness, just like mine. And at that point, like, Habaru's like, oh, what are you talking about? And Ruri just turns away like, hey, anyway, thank you for sharing all of this with us, Kimpa. I know that was very difficult for you. Like, Wakui, like, did you really have to shove that down our face? Like, oh, an astro born from sadness, just like mine. Like, you could have showed us that in a different way and not had Ruri just say it to where it's like, okay, we're going to learn Ruri's backstory eventually, and it's going to be sad. Look at that, like, come on, dude. You have written much better. I enjoy Tokyo Avengers, but Tokyo Avengers did not have a moment like this where I go, Wakui. Like, come on, bro. Like, I can't believe it. Well, at this point, Ruri then just starts to speak up again, like, hey, but here's the thing, we now know a little bit more about the whole Daybreak Ore situation. The Daybreak Ore was said to turn wishes into energy, and Astros made wishes come true. So it's hard to think those two things are totally unrelated, right? The whole sort of team just sort of talks about all of this sort of deal going on here, as eventually Habaru just says like, yeah, and he's like, Shio and Himuro are really fighting over a really dangerous power. If the Daybreak Ore could be used as a new kind of nuclear weapon, we need to get it back and destroy it. And everybody's like, oh yeah, you're so correct. At this point, Kuran, who has turned into a hawk, has sort of shapeshifted, comes and runs into the building or flies into the building. He's like, hey guys, we've got trouble. He untransforms inside of everybody, and everybody's like, oh, you can turn yourself into a bird, right? It's sort of whatever there. But Kuran pretty much says like, hey, all right guys, hey, the helicopter's coming and it's the cops. As everybody's like, what? As they look out, and they see the ladder is dangling down from this helicopter, and hanging off the ladder is none other than Himuro, right? And everybody's like, what in the world? Why is Himuro here, right? And they're like, and I even find it really funny that, like, Hokaru's like, Himuro, what's going on? And Kimpa goes, oh, Himuro, what's going on? And then Terasu says, that's Himuro from Unit 6. And Ruri's like, did he follow us? Like, you could have just said Himuro once, and we would have known what you were talking about. You could have showed Kimpa to where it's like, all right, yeah, she has something going on with Himuro. We know that after last chapter, but it's like, come on, Wakui. Like, that's just a really weird way. You don't need to say, oh, that's Harumo. Harumo? Wow, that's Harumo from Unit 6. It's like, I'm not going to say I could write this better, because I still think that this is a good chapters we'll get to by the end of it, but, like, I feel like a few of, like, Wakui's, like, writing styles here is just a little bit like, come on, bro. We didn't get introduced to Himuro again as if we didn't get introduced to him, like, 2 chapters ago. Like, again, come on here. Like, really? Is that what we're doing? Homura then just says, like, hey, well, looks like the gang is all here. Kinpa is shaking after seeing him, and she just says, like, hey, weak Kinpa, like, stop shaking, like, you're weak Kinpa, like, just disappear, right? As we see that she's sort of, like, breaking down a little bit. And Ruri's like, hey, we need to retreat, like, we can't be doing this here. Of course, Habaru has that sort of, like, hot-blooded Yatsurugi blood in him, starts to run up and uses a bare-handed magnum blast on Himuro. We see that some lady sort of gets in front of him and sort of, like, deflects Habaru's punch, as then all of a sudden, Hikumo then just says, like, or Himuro, my bad, Himuro. It's like, hey, I guess maybe they need to reinforce the name more if I keep forgetting it, but whatever. Himuro then just says, like, hello, guys, arresting Torazo was a trap. I wanted to see how all of you guys would react, but I'm sure it wasn't expecting you guys to bring the Yotsurugis all the way out to this deserted island. And the Furokiri daughter, too. Damn, I got really lucky. I guess that underage brat and the lawyer to thank for it. Now I get to wipe out all of you useless fools in one go. As he pulls out a really weird looking gun, and he then fires it, calling out the move name Sakuri's Kiss. As we see that Tarasu sort of gets it away, uses his shield Astro, and we pretty much see like this massive ice conglomerate starts to form on the shield. As everybody's like, ice, interesting, so this may be his Astro's power, right? Himuro is then just like, hey, nice reflexes you got there. As Ruri then yells to Habaru like, hey, Kinpa's gone, like what's going on here? As Himuro just says like, oh, that girl I guess has ton, tail, and run, huh? Well, keep running, Furokuri brat, but I don't matter if you're scared stiff, you run and hide, right? Because you can never outrun the law. As he's just being, like, overly evil in this moment, right? Let's, like, shooting off his gun into the air, being like, yeah, this guy's a bit of a crazy one. As Habaru's just like, do you really think Kinpa ran? As Habaru thinks back to whenever, presumably whenever they were much younger, after Kinpa's parents had died, and Genji had adopted her, where they were sort of training in the martial arts room, and Kinpa asked Habaru to like help her train, just like, I want to be strong. And at this point, Habaru just says like, hey, you've got more guts than that, don't you, Kinpa? As all of a sudden, Habaru is standing here, and he feels a little pat on his back. Because of course, this is Kinpa, who is invisible with her Astro, who has sort of put her hand on the back of Habaru, right? As Kinpa sort of just walks out, we see like this silhouettes, but nobody can of course see her, that she is invisible. As Kinpa just thinks like, hey, thanks Habaru. I was shaking with adrenaline and excitement, but you really helped me calm down. Because I've been waiting for this day for so long, I wanted to make myself weak and disappear. That's what I wished for on the asteroid as I clutched my mother's compact, right? As we just remember more of Kinpa's story here, she's just like, remembers her mother like, hey, don't cry, Kinpa. I was prepared to die for this and I made peace with it. And that's all because my life is a battle. Remember this line that, of course, we learned that Kinpa's mother used a whole lot last chapter, right? As all of a sudden we hear Kinpa yell out, Himuro! And Himuro like looks around like, oh, where is she? I don't see her. As all of a sudden, we see that Kinpa comes through with a flying kick straight across Himuro's face, right? And Himuro sort of like skids along the ground as Kinpa just proclaims like, I will never run away from you. As she just says, and that's because my life is a battle, right? And at this point, Habaru's like, haha, look at that. I told you were just like your mom, Kinpa. And that's where we end off this chapter of Astro Royale. I don't feel like this whole thing of, like, my life is a battle was really expanded on enough to, like, be this big moment where, like, Kinpa comes through and uses this attack on Himuro. And, of course, Himuro's not knocked out here. He's just going to get up even more pissed next time. But it was sort of nice to see this, in a way, seeing this character development for Kinpa after we learned her backstory last time. I don't think the whole my life is a battle thing is enough to sort of make up for this entire chapter, but I do feel like this was a decently cool moment where, like, Kinpa walks up, puts a hand on Habaru's back, and Habaru just says, like, I know you're stronger than this, Kinpa. I knew it from the beginning. It is a really, really cool moment. But like I said, I do have a few other flaws with this chapter. not that it's terrible, like, it's got a few redeeming qualities, but, like, total thing of Rary, like, an Astro board from Sadness, just like mine. Like, come on, Will Ackley, you were just trying to force that, weren't you? But fine Astro Royale chapter, nothing really too terrible to, like, yeah, this was bad. But with that, I think, what is that? Is that 4 chapters through? Yeah. We now have 6 chapters remaining. All right, and as we start off on these last 6 chapters, our first chapter is Hima-Ten, chapter number 13. We see a bit of a, I don't say we see a bit, we have a color page at the beginning of this chapter, which is simply just Yoshino in her sort of more casual form, like whenever she's working and stuff, not like when she's made up for school and all of that. And we see that she's sort of just holding out a little, like, gummy thing on, like, a toothpick, holding it out by somebody. Yep, this chapter is number 13, called Study Group. Nice color page, but, like, it really is what it is. But obviously this series is doing good enough to get a color page at chapter 13. We're looking up for this. And as far as, like, chapters of Hima-Ten have gone, this is definitely the most, like, Nisekoi chapter that we have gotten of Hima-Ten yet. And what do I mean by that? We will get to it by the end, but this was just a very nice, heartwarming chapter of Hima-Ten, all things considered, right? We see that midterm exams are coming up in the whole Hima-Ten universe. And we pretty much see that Iamori sitting down doing some studying, and he's just like, all right, it's almost exam time. Even while I'm busy cleaning houses and doing all my other work, I still have to keep up my schoolwork too. I can't be slacking and all of that. And we see he's just working on some math problems, and he's sort of like thinking out loud to himself, like, all right, how do I solve this one again? Like, I'm having a few problems with it. As all of a sudden, we see that Kanai pops up right beside him and says, like, oh, that one's pretty hard there, right? As Iamori's like, oh, Kanai, what are you doing here, right? As Kanai's just like, oh, well, can I show you, like, how to do that problem? And Iamori's like, oh, yeah, I mean, please, like, I wouldn't mind. As she pretty much explains, like, all right, you do all this math stuff like this, and, like, there you go, do you understand it? Iamori's like, oh, thank you so very much. As Kanai's is like, hey, don't mention it at all. And she's like, I know you're putting in a lot of effort, even though your job is keeping you busy. And Iamori's like, hey, now that I think about it, you've always been good at studying and in school, right, Kanai? And Kanai's like, oh, yeah, I mean, I haven't, but that's, like, not really anything for me to brag at. Like, I'm not really good at anything else. Like, me being good at schoolwork is just, like, one of the only things I have going on for me, right? But Iamori's like, no, like, don't say that. Like, I actually think, like, being good at academics is actually, like, really impressive in its own way. Like, you've got a brain, like, better than me and a lot of other people here, right? And at this point, Kanai's like, well, maybe you have time. But before she can sort of finish this sentence, all of a sudden, her friend Mayu sort of busts into the room. It's like, hey, Honoka, Kanai, do you want to study together today? And Kanai's like, oh, yeah, I mean, I can. As we see that Mayu's also like, oh, hey, Iamori, how are you doing? Mayu is the sort of friend that Kanai has. It's popped up a few times in this series. I'm going to go ahead and say it now. I think Mayu is incredibly annoying. I understand her purpose is to be, like, the wing woman of this situation between Iamori and Kanai, but, like, she is, like, such a bubbly and positive attitude. It's like, come on, do people actually act like this? Like, you are way too happy hearing all of these things going on. Like, I refuse to believe that a person like this actually exists in the real world. But Mayu Brin just says, like, hey, Kanai, what were you and Iamori talking about? And like, oh, we were just talking about studying and all of that sort of stuff there, right? And as all of this is sort of going on, there's this whole idea of, like, right, Mayu and Kanai are going to be doing some studying again later. And at this point, Iamori just is like, hey, Kanai, Kanoe, I'm really struggling with some of this math stuff. If it's okay with you, could I, like, join in? And he sort of, like, raised up his hand, like, to answer a question. And Kanai's like, but she doesn't really say anything, as all of a sudden, Mayu's like, oh, of course you can, you bet you, like, isn't that awesome, Hanoka, right? And Kanai's like, what do you mean? She's like, yeah, I mean, I guess it's nice, but, and Iamori's like, oh, thank you guys so very much, like, please teach me how, like, to do the math correctly, right? We then cut to later in the day where Iamori's just sitting around in his homeroom class, as I love that Iamori's like, all right, score. Like, I've got something going on later today. Like, he's really happy, like, that he scored this moment to hang out with Kanai. Like, it makes sense, like, all right, this guy is going to be hanging out with the girl he likes at school, so it's like, all right, it sort of makes sense why he's going to be sitting there like, score, this is actually so incredibly awesome, right? But at this point, Yoshino sort of is there beside him. He's like, hey, good for you, Iomori. And Iomori's like, hey, what do you mean, Yoshino? And she's like, hey, do you get to study? Do you get to have a study session with Hanoka later today, right? And she says, like, hey, Kanai also invited me, but I've got to go and do work. Like, it sucks being a president of a big company. Like, so terrible, right? And Iomori's like, oh, yeah, like, there's a little bit of a moment between Yoshino and Iomori where Yoshino's like, hey, I can't believe you have to save up tuition and also keep up all of your schoolwork at the same time. Iomori's like, hey, well, you see, when you work so hard like Kanatu, so I feel like I need to as well. So even if that's not all in my schoolwork totally, like, yeah, it's sort of a little bit of a nice moment between the two of them, right? But then we just see that Yoshino pretty much buys a drink for Iomori, pretty much saying like, hey, it's yogurt. I know you've been studying all morning, so it should be like a nice little break for you during the day, right? Iomori's like, hey, thank you very much. And as all of this is happening, as Yoshino's sort of walking away, she sort of thinks like, hey, right, Iomori's also always working so hard since he got stuff on his own plate. But unlike Hanoka, the only thing I've done for him is pay him for his work, right? We then cut to the library where, of course, the study session is going on with, of course, Kanai, Iomori, and, of course, Mayu. Mayu's bubbly personality is just going so much on here. She's being very loud and annoying and pretty much pushing Kanai and Iomori to be doing work with each other, right? Kanai eventually is like, all right, Iomori, what part are you struggling with? Iomori's like, this entire page, I barely get any of this, right? And Kanai sort of just leans in really close to him, and she sort of does that move where she takes her hand and, like, pushes her hair behind her ears, sort of get into the work. And Iomori just sees this, like, oh god, I need to focus on studying and doing the work and not paying attention to Kanai here. Like, look at all of this. And Mayu this entire time is just staring and just, like, being very, very annoying, right? And it eventually just gets to the point where two of them are working together a whole lot. A little bit of narration, like, hey, but right, Kanai is using her personal time to tutor me, so I've got to give this everything I got, as Iomori is just thinking about this whole situation. We then cut outside to where the study session is now over. Kanai's like, all right, hey, that's good, we got a lot of studying done today. Iomori's like, yeah, like, it's been really exhausting, like, my brain is so fried, but, like, thank you so much, Kanai, like, I feel a whole lot better about all my work. And Kanai's like, hey, no worries, I barely did anything for you, like, it's not that big of a deal. But she then makes it of like, hey, I'm actually glad that you weren't struggling that much. Like, you didn't really need as much of my help as you thought you did. Like, you had a lot of the concepts down on your own. And she just says, like, hey, I always notice you, like, take a lot of... She's like, I always notice that you take class very seriously after all. And, Iomori's like, huh? Like, what are you talking about? Mayu gets back in a way, and Mayu just says, like, hey, yeah, Hanoka always got good grades, but from what I remember, you weren't so bad yourself in middle school either, Iomori, right? And Iomori's like, yeah, but that doesn't mean, like, I'm not bad at, like, high school. Like, yeah, I may have been good at middle school. Like, high school is a whole different type of beast, right? But Iomori just says, like, hey, I just managed to scrape by. When it comes to chores, that's a skill you can't really show off in a classroom, right? And he says, that's what it is. But I already know that I can't focus all my effort there. School is important also, right? Kanai gives a little smile like, hey, but you're also putting a lot of effort into housework too. So, like, I really admire that about you. And Iomori's like, well, I do get paid for it, so I sort of need to do a good job at it, right? At this point, Mayu just sort of runs completely away, like getting herself out of the situation to leave both Kanai and Iomori alone together, right? And at this point, Iomori just says, like, oh, so Kanai, there's been something I've been really meaning to ask you about. Why do you always worry about me, right? And Kanai's like, oh, like, what are you talking about? And Iomori just says, like, hey, like, you invited me out to, like, to that stand-up show, and, Kanai's like, hey, that was just because Mayu couldn't go, and I didn't know who else would want to go, and you were just there, so it sort of worked out pretty well today. As Iomori's like, yeah, I understand that, but, like, you also tutored me today. As at this point, we cut the scene over to Yoshino, who is, of course, working in her home office, as she just thinks to herself, like, hey, I wonder if Iomori and Hanoka are still studying together. As she just thinks, like, hey, Hanoka is way too nice, so I can't tell. But what if, and she doesn't quite finish this sentence yet, as Kanai just says also, like, hey, if you were in my shoes, would have you tutored me today? And she says, like, I mean, if I were too busy to study and you were completely ready for exams, and you saw me trying to study, would you also want to help me, Iomori? And Iomori's like, well, I think I probably would. And Kanai just says, like, yeah, well, I feel the same way about you. And we then cut back to Yoshino's statement as, again, it's like, hey, so I can't tell, but if Iomori also likes Hinoka, what will I do? And that is where we end off this chapter of Hima-Ten with a sort of little bit of like a mini confession by Kanai here, talking to Iomori, two people who we know clearly like each other, and also sort of looking at Hamari's sort of point of view of like, okay, like, we know that she thinks something about Iomori. I mean, we sort of saw that last chapter with the whole Kana stuff going on. So a little bit of an interesting thing here. I'm interested to see where Hima-Ten goes next, but really cute chapter, like, all things considered. Like, really nice seeing all of these kids study together. Now, Mayu may go in, like, the history books as one of my least favorite manga characters because she is so incredibly annoying. At least in Nezuko, you had the character of Shu, who was, like, that comic relief character, but I feel like Shu had at least a few parts to him that made him more interesting than Mayu, who's like, oh yeah, I want these two to fuck, so I'm going to do everything in my power to get them to go out and be loud and obnoxious as possible. Like, golly, I do not like Mayu. That's like my one takeaway from Hima-Ten, besides this chapter was absolutely amazing. Alright, and with that, it's now time to move on to Ultimate Excess Kiyoshi, chapter number 15. This chapter is titled The Final Test. And of course, as you'd expect, this chapter is about the final test going on here with the whole deal of, what is it called? The Grand Cross test or whatever it is. I totally forget, but in typical normal Ultimate Excess Kiyoshi fashion, today I'll be doing the Ultimate Excess Kiyoshi speed round where I see how fast I can talk about this chapter of Ultimate Excess Kiyoshi, while also breaking down all of the main points to get introduced in this chapter. So let me take a swig of my drink and get ready, and then we will see how fast I can talk about this chapter of Ultimate Excess Kiyoshi. And yeah, I want to beat 3 minutes today. That's my goal. I think this video has been going on for a good little while, and I think I can probably tear down this chapter pretty quick. Alright, on a mark of 1, 2, and 3, let's begin. Okay, so this chapter of Ultimate Excess Kiyoshi starts off with the whole idea of like, alright, 12 of you have passed the first 2 phases of the Grand Cross test, and now will be the final obstacle standing in your way to becoming a Grand Cross. And it's rather simple. You guys will have to face off against 3 other Grand Crosses. We get introduced to 3 other Grand Crosses as part of this church. One of them is the Demon Realm Special Forces, Toji Shuten. One is Deputy Commander of the Synagus, Yoko Ono. One of them is Commander of the Deep Green Knights, Senpai Yana. We learned that this Senpai Yana is actually the father to the other Yana who was being very antagonistic to Tosaka earlier. Sosuke pretty much hears this like, right, so in short, we pretty much have to beat up these guys and we'll be passing this test. That sounds good. We then see that Toji Shuten comes up sort of behind Sosuke and just says like, hey, yeah, that works. If you're going to become a Grand Cross, and that's kind of spirit you need, right? And there's a little funny joke here where Tosaka's like, man, Sosuke's like arrogance knows no bounds, and Kiyoshi's like, oh man, Hitsurugi is so damn cool, right? And we then understand the mashups that will be going around here is going to be 4v1 in terms of fighting the Grand Crosses. Pretty much we see that Sosuke is going to end up fighting against Toji Shuten, and then we see, more importantly, that Tosaka and Kiyoshi will end up fighting against Senpai Yana, right? Hitsurugi then says like, all right, I'm gonna go and start to take on Shuten, but one of the other people starts to come out, one of the other exorcists from the Concordian Knights that, of course, Hitsurugi is affiliated with, just says like, hey, hold it, why not let your senior get a little credit? She's like, I haven't got enough on a rampage yet. As we see that she's wearing something called Grand Cross Armor, and the guy's like, hey, that's a little bit of a rarity. She goes over to make an attack, and all of a sudden, we see that Shuten pretty much like holds up a finger and cracks a little bit of the armor, right? At this point, we see that Yana, who is, of course, what was his full name? Senpai Yana, who is, of course, the one who Tosaka and Kiyoshi have to go against, has already beat the other two opponents and calls them terribly weak. So now it is up to Tosaka and to Kiyoshi to be able to deal and fight with him, right? Tosaka's like, all right, you save your strength, Kiyoshi, I'll go up first. As Tosaka pretty much like runs over and like, hey, it's been a long time, Mr. Yana, good to see you're sort of in decent health. Yana pretty much talks down to Tosaka like, hey, I'm surprised you've lasted this long. It just goes to show how much of a joke this test really is. He talks bad to a lot of people, and pretty much we see that Tosaka's like, all right, Yana, I didn't come all this way just to make small talk, see these things. All right, I'm going to become a Grand Cross. As he pulls out a weapon out of his pocket, and it's a handle, and pretty much he uses some exorcism powers to make a pentagram sword out of it. A pretty cool design. He runs up and over towards Yana. A little bit of a fight here. He cuts down all these vines, looks really, really good while doing it. And Yana pretty much is like, oh, it looks like you have improved a little bit, actually, Tosaka. But that won't be enough. Cook the Exorcist bird then comes in to sort of help out a little bit on this plan, as we then just see that Yana uses a solid green jack attack, right? And sort of almost summons a beanstalk from the ground, as he just says, all right, Tosaka, you are done, and shoves him to the ground. Before all this happens, though, Tosaka puts his hand up in the air, and Cook comes flying down into it, and he sort of takes it in with him. As Yana then just says, like, hey, what good will attaching a bird to your arm end up doing? And just says, lock this place down. As this beanstalk is pretty much formed around where Tosaka is, but Tosaka then swings open with his arm, and all of a sudden, this beanstalk has been cut in half. As all of a sudden, Tosaka just says, like, hey, he isn't just some bird, he's Cook the Exorcist bird. As we now see that Cook is in Cook Obliterator mode, as we pretty much see that Tosaka has this pretty much sword in Cook, pretty much, right? Tosaka's looking really good at this battle and just thinks about all the people who's made him come this far, and it's like, hey, I made it this far, it's taken a long time, but I need to make sure I beat the test this time so I can stand proudly shoulder to shoulder with them. Of course, thinking about Sosuke and Kiyoshi, right? And he's like, I will become a Grand Cross. And he completely knocks Yana onto the ground and puts Cook's sort of horn up to his head like, all right, this match is over. You are done, Yana. We see that both Sosuke and Kiyoshi sort of take note of this, like, Mr. Tosaka, that's not bad at all, right? Yana then just says, like, oh, so you had a secret weapon this entire time? You've grown in these last 3 years, I will give you that. Well done, Tosaka. For the final phase of the Grand Cross exam, you pass. Is that what you thought, I would say? Sort of pulling the reversal as he uses some more of his beanstalk powers and pretty much knocks the crap out of Tosaka, right? And pretty much, Yana just says, like, hey, demons will use whatever means they can to beat you up, so just think 2 simple words were all it took to get you off your guard. You're soft, Tosaka. You failed this exam. As Kyoshi's like, what is this going on? Like, that's so stupid. And pretty much he just sort of talks back to Yana here a little bit. And we see that Yana has his foot on Cook, almost getting ready to crush him. But, of course, Kiyoshi comes in, sort of saves the day here. And we just see that Tosaka's like, hey, I'm sorry, Hirai. And Kyoshi's like, hey, no, Hirai. And Kyoshi's like, hey, Tosaka, save your strength. It's going to be okay. And Tosaka's like, hey, and after I made it all of this way, I knew it. I'm just not strong enough. Don't make that face at me. I'll just take the test again next year. Kiyoshi, good luck. Get out there and pass this test. As Yana just says, like, hey, who do you think you actually are? And Kiyoshi says, like, hey, so you want me to treat you like you're a demon? And he was like, yes, obviously. And Kiyoshi says, like, all right, in that case, I'm going to exorcise the hell out of you. And that's where we finish off this chapter of Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi. I don't think that was 3 minutes whatsoever. I feel like that was much, much longer than 3 minutes. I think that was probably like 5 or 6, but we'll see what the editing process tells me. But good episode of Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi, all things considered. A lot of fun here. I really love seeing how Tosaka sort of got made up to be a badass, and like, he did some really awesome movement. He really beat the shit out of Yana a little bit, and it looked like he was going to win. But of course, Yana is like, all right, this guy is comically, cartoonishly evil. Of course, he's not going to let Tasaka get his way, which will be some nice motivation for Kiyoshi to sort of get out there and beat the crap out of this guy, which should be a very interesting thing that's going to happen next chapter. And also, like, this may be, like, the issue of, like, jump one-liners to, like, end off the chapters. Like, we had Kagurabachi, like, hey, cut it with the bullshit. We had the whole thing in Ichi the Witch was like, hey, how about we do a little witch hunting instead? And like all of these things are like really, really cool. And like finally getting to this last one, I mean, even so, the sort of moment with like Kinpa is like, hey, because my life's a battle, you can look at that. That's pretty cool. But like this one's like, I'm gonna exercise the hell out of you. This is a really cool thing for somebody to say. Like, hats off to Ultimate Exorcist Kiyoshi. But with that, we got 4 chapters left. All right, next up is Akane-banashi, chapter number 129. This chapter is titled, Is This Rakugo? With a question mark, because it's like, hey, is this Rakugo? Now, of course, last time in Akane-banashi, we had the whole reveal of like, all right, well, it wasn't really a reveal, but it was Akane coming to sit down to have Master Shiguma teach her all of the stuff going on and finally teach her Shiguma's art. And that's where we ended off the last chapter. And this one starts off in a little bit of an interesting way, as we have a lot of cityscape shots sort of open up this chapter, as we just see like a kid like playing with hoses, some kids playing around outside, like just a lot of like the emotions and stuff going on outside around in the world. And then we see that Akane and Shiguma are sort of kneeling with each other, and we just see they're both portrayed in like black and white silhouettes, as Shiguma just sort of goes through the story. We don't hear anything he says, but he just goes through it and he tells this story, and he is off saying like, right, and that is Shiguma's art. So what do you think, Akane, right? And Akane's like, well, what do I think? Like, is that story even Rakugo? And Shiguma's like, hey, I wondered the same thing the first time I heard it also, but Shiguma's art is fundamentally different from other stories. He says, do you now understand why Shiguma's art is unfinished, right? And Shiguma just says like, hey, what I just taught you is merely the framework. How you choose to fill it in will depend on the path you travel on as a futatsume, right? As Akane just says like, well, alright then, Master, how did you perform this story, right? And Shiguma sort of like shakes his head a little bit. He says like, well, you see, I already heard the previous Shiguma's art, and I certainly can't deliver anything that lives up to it. I didn't think myself worthy of the challenge to it, and eventually, I lost the right to perform it at all, which really builds up Shiguma's art as more of like this mythical tale almost. Like, it's so interesting like how this Rakugo series has built up this sort of theory and idea of Shiguma's art to a point where it's like, this almost seems like legendary or mythical that Akane is not only learning this, and like, it's even more interesting that we as the audience don't know what it is either. Like, we don't know what Shiguma's art is, besides it's this really weird and interesting Rakugo story that, whenever it's performed, is going to be like showing off. Like, of course, there's that saying like, Jump's best manga continues to be Jump's best manga, and as we'll get to, this is one of those Akane-banashi chapters where it's like, this manga is special, right? But Shiguma just says like, hey, I lost the right to perform it at all, and he's like, but this would have happened with Isho Anisan, I suspect. And Akane's like, huh? As all of a sudden Shiguma just says like, hey, Isho Anisan wasn't allowed to learn Shiguma's art. And he's like, which is why he chases and pines for it. It will be the means by which you can win his personal acceptance. And Akane hears this, of course, is like, oh, I can gain Isho's acceptance by like doing this story. And she's sort of like, gets a little bit excited about this. As Shiguma just says like, hey, it is totally fine to be motivated, but it's a long and treacherous path before you, Akane, right? And Akane says like, hey, but I'm sure it's also the same for you. I humbly ask your wisdom and forbearance in the long days ahead. And Akane just sort of laughs a little bit. She's like, yeah, that was a little bit of a stupid thing for me to say. As Shiguma sort of just like smiles at her a little bit and says like, hey, well, first then we need to work on your overall ability. At the time I learned this story, the previous Shiguma told me to master 3 stories to the point where they could be called my specialties. And he's like, and that's before he can sort of finish off this sort of sentence and this idea, all of a sudden the doorbell rings at the Shiguma Manor. as this guy outside yells, "It's the delivery," as Shiguma's like, "Oh, hey, that's a plastic model kit of Kodama Castle I ordered. Like, it's finally in. I'm so excited, right?" As he just yells out, like, "Go, just a minute," or no, Akane says, like, "Oh, just a minute, I'll rush the door and handle this." But as she sort of starts to get off of her knees, she falls over a little bit because, as she says, like, "Hey, my legs are very numb from staying on the ground for so long." And Shiguma is just like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you're doing this." And he walks out to, or he gets up and walks off to go to the door to pick up this package of his, of this model kit of Kodama Castle. And Akane just says, like, "Hey, this doesn't even happen to me during performances." And we pretty much learn a little bit of a Rakugo fun fact. During a performance, the performers are moving their body back and forth, so, like, their legs aren't, like, falling asleep. But whenever they're just sitting center like that, like in the formal sitting style, their legs fall asleep really, really easily, and that is simply what has just happened to Akane here, right? Well, Akane just thinks about all of these things that have just happened in her learning this little bit about Shiguma's art and all of this stuff, as she just thinks, like, man, it's been 2.5 years since then, and it's finally starting. My personal path to Shinichi. And she's thinking all of this. The doorbell rings again, and Akane's like, again, like, okay, what's going on with this? And she starts to walk over to the door, and she's like, why does Shiguma get so many deliveries? And I'm like, I guess I know why. I mean, he was always buying so much stuff in Shibuya. He really loves this stuff, and maybe having hobbies isn't the best thing. As she finally walks into the main parlor area of the area, as she sees a guy who's there at the door, and as she looks over, we see Shiguma slumped over on the floor, as Akane just says, "Oh, master?" And when we talk about manga chapters that bring a visceral reaction out of me as a reader, there were 2 of them this week. I'll go and say it, Blue Box was the other one. But I was reading this chapter in my dorm room earlier, and my roommate was sitting in the room. He's not currently in here, and if he was, I'd get him to attest because he saw me do this. As I am flipping through this chapter, I'm like, oh, that's really funny. Like, I laughed the whole joke of, like, oh, Shiguma builds Kodomo Castle. Like, that's really, really fun. And all of a sudden, it's like Akane's reflecting on all of her life so far and, like, all the time she spent with Shiguma. And that page turn, that final page where we see Shiguma slumped over on the ground after the doorbell rings, again, it's like, oh, like, okay, maybe something's happened to Shiguma. And when you flip the page and you see Shiguma laying on the ground, like, I took a good 5 minutes where I just was silent to myself, just like, what, like, it's just a page turn, like, 110%, like, Akane-banashi continues to be Shonen Jump's best manga, and it's not a battle shonen, like, a crazy event that happened in this chapter. So hats off to the authors of the series. I forget their names this second. I think it's Yukino or no, yeah, Yuki Suenaga and Takamasa Mue. I need to know what happens next in Akane-banashi. Like, you expect to show me that Shiguma's on the ground, and, like, for me not to go, like, what, like, oh, great chapter of Akane-banashi. Like, this is a chapter of the week. There's no getting around that. Like, amazing chapter. Let's move on to Blue Box, chapter number 167. This chapter is titled, If It's Not Too Late. Of course, we know that Ayame is running Kyo down to the nurse's office because, of course, he's not doing too well, right? And, of course, in the last chapter, Kyo pretty much just said, like, hey, Ayame, I like you, like, very, very quietly. And Ayame's like, hey, did he just say something? As she's sort of carting him around. We see some of the other, like, classmates who know Kyo, like, hey, Kyo, don't die on us. And Ayame's like, shut up, like, he doesn't need to be hearing all of that right now. As they pretty much get into the nurse's office, and they're like, hey, what gives? The nurse isn't here right now. They're like, all right, I'll go look for her. As they start to mess around with everything going on here, and Ayame sort of expects room and says, like, oh, let's see, like, there's ice and drinks, like, why is there nothing in here today, right? Which sort of makes sense that this is, like, the day, so, like, all of the resources are scattered around the school and probably not in the nurse's office, but it's still a little weird. You'd expect, like, all right, if there's so many people at the school doing untypical school things today, maybe a few people would get injured, so maybe, like, whatever. This chapter is not meant to hold, like, the suspension of disbelief going on as all this stuff happens, right? As Ayami's like, alright, well, I'll go buy some stuff, so just take it easy, Kyo. As they pretty much, like, put some cooling stuff on his head. And as Ayami leaves the room, she just says, like, man, I wonder why Kyo overworks himself like this. Well, the school festival continues on for a while, and we eventually see that Saki eventually finds Kyo inside of the room. And she sort of just walks over, pulls up a seat next to where Kyo is. And Saki's like, oh, Kyo, are you okay? Like, I heard you fell earlier, and that almost gave me a heart attack hearing it. Like, you're always too quick to endure all of this pain, Kyo. Like, we almost need to hook up some sensors to your body to be able to pay attention to what's going on to you, right? But Saki just says, like, man, Kyo, but when exactly did you become such a stoic person? Saki then just continues saying, like, hey, you used to be so much of a more honest person. I really wonder if that's my fault. It's just things like, hey, as the eldest of 4 kids, Kyo needed someone who could rely on, so I hoped I could be like a big sister to him. But Kyo, the problem is that you liked me. And she's like, and that was the opposite of what I really wanted. I didn't want you to get stronger. And she's like, I did not want you to become stronger just to stop me from saying I'm fine. As Saki sort of is like going through all these emotions that she's feeling, and she just says, like, I'm sorry, Kyo. The old me wanted to be a strong and reliable girl, and I've never been cute enough to take advantage of all of your kindness. I couldn't even show you how weak I was, and I ended up hurting you, Kyo. But I finally realized that people like you are 1 in a million. And she's like, at first, when I had fun when my heart raced, and I was swept up and away by romance. But as time went on, the balloon would slowly deflate, and she thinks of her previous boyfriend, like, them doing stuff together, like, it was so fun in the beginning, but eventually whenever she got cheated on by her boyfriend, she just sort of starts to remember Kyo again, as she just thinks, like, hey, I never realized how important it was to feel certain that some things would never change, as she thinks about Kyo, the sort of force that's always been in her life. As she just says, Kyo, if it's not too late, please stay here with me. As we see that she's sort of crying, got some tears welling up in her eyes. And she bends down to where Kyo is, and presumably puts her mouth right up to Kyo's mouth and gives him a little kiss, or maybe just a kiss on the face. We don't know. It looks like Saki gives Kyo a little kiss as he's laying down here, right? At this point, who else would start to enter the room but Ayame? We see that she's bought a bunch of various drinks for Kyo as all this is going on. But she sees Saki in here, and she just turns and just walks away. She doesn't even drop the drinks off or anything. She just simply moves away as all this happens. And at this point, it looks like Kyo maybe wakes up. It's a little bit weird as all of this works, but we'll get all of this in a second. As, yeah, I'm sorry. The next part of this chapter gets a little bit confusing, right? As Kyo's just like, ew, hey, what are you doing? And Saki's like, hey, I was just checking your fever. And Kyo's like, hey, that's a lie too, and I know it. And he says, hey, I've been listening. And he's like, hey, I'm sorry. I'm already a 2nd year in high school. I have changed, Saki. And there's someone else I like now, right? And Saki hears this and starts to tear up a little bit as she starts to sort of run away. It's like, oh, hey, my friends, they're buying me cotton candy out somewhere. As Kyo just starts saying, like, hey, wait, Saki. And she's just like, hey, I'll see you later, Kyo. And she sort of just starts to run away a little bit. As all of a sudden, Kyo imagines this a little bit. As Ayame pops out from around the corner. We can tell this is a little bit of an imagined sequence because, of course, Ayame has her pigtails up and she's in her regular school attire. And we also see that Kyo has his glasses on in this little scenario when, of course, he normally wouldn't because he's just in the bed, right? But Ayame pops out the window and just says, like, hey, I just saw your childhood friend running off. Is everything okay between you two? And Kyo's like, hey, there's nothing I can do about it. Like, I thought if I didn't tell her outright, I'd end up regretting it, right? And Ayame's like, hey, I overheard that little bit of what you guys were talking about. Did I hear that you actually like someone, Kyo? And Kyo just says, like, oh yeah, you heard right. I like you, Ayame. And we see that Ayame sort of gives Kyo this little bit of an interesting stare and grin and all as all of this happens. As next thing we know, we see Kyo's eyes actually opening up, right? as everybody's like, hey, Kyo, are you okay? And Kyo's like, hey, what's going on? And like, hey, it looks like you had a nice nap. Are you feeling any better? Like, your parents should be here soon. We alerted them. We brought all of your stuff. Like, too bad this happened on the day of the culture festival, but it sort of is what it is. And after all the hard work you put in, like we're really starting to have all of this going on, Kyo, right? But pretty much his classmates just say like, hey, Kyo, but here's the thing. Thanks to you, the haunted house was like a massive success. So they said like, hey, I guess you could call it credit of some sort of arousal, because some people were dating by the time they got out of the maze there, right? And this is like, well, meanwhile, Ichi made a public declaration of his love, and then got rejected hard in front of so many people, right? And Kyo's like, hey, like, you guys got a water bottle around somewhere? And as they asked this, Kyo's two classmates and just said like, oh, he's like, hey, you know what else is going on? Ayame and Tasasako from Class C are now going out. And that's where we end this chapter of Blue Box. And when I say a visceral reaction of a chapter, as I was reading this chapter, I was going through and I'm like, Saki, oh my gosh, like, you've been the antagonist of this series now for months, like, coming on to Kyo, ruining, like, the whole Ayame and Kyo debacle going on here. And then to sort of reveal all of this stuff, like, I want to be, like, a sister to you, and, oh, like, Saki is an evil person, like, I know she isn't, but it's, like, in the context of this romance manga, like, Saki, you are evil, like, you are the main antagonist of this joint going on here, right? And then the whole thing of, like, alright, was Kyo actually up, and did Saki hear Kyo say that, or was that sort of also a dream sequence as a whole thing with Ayame was? Which also is like, yeah, Kyo likes Ayame. We found it out last chapter, and seeing this sort of escalation here was really interesting. I also like how you can clearly tell, because, like, the art style is a little bit lighter during the sequence as stuff goes on, and also them being in their regular school attires, Kyo having his glasses on, Ayame in her pigtails and all of that stuff, makes it clear, like, yeah, this isn't actually happening in the present. And then that final note of, like, hey, Mori and Tasako from Class C are going out now. It's like, no, you cannot be treating my heart like this. What are you doing, Blue Box? I hate you, I love you, I hate you, I love you. Like, this series is... Blue Box is great. This was the second best chapter of the week. There's no getting around that. Like, if a chapter gets a visceral reaction out of me where I literally went like, fuck you, Saki, like, great chapter of Blue Box, all things considered. Alright, 2 chapters left, and the second to last chapter is the Elusive Samurai, chapter number 175. This chapter is titled Responsibility 1338. Of course, last time, Shizuku decided to fully release her power in this moment to be able to stop Mima and be able to save all of the other elusive warriors and all of the other members of Kitabatake's crew, as they all are selling to their various points of like, hey, this is where military stuff is going on. And pretty much like, hey, the wind is blocking the storm and driving it towards the enemy. As we see that Ayako looks up and we see that Shizuku is in her ethereal sort of like ghostly form a little bit. As we sort of... As an excellent part of this chapter is actually built on a lot of narration, specifically coming from Mima, as she pretty much thinks like, hey, she was using most of her divine power to maintain her physical form, so not much was really left over in the end. But if she was prepared to disappear from existence, then no human can withstand her power, right? Mima then just thinks like, many people's memories flooded into me. I believe my beauty surpassed that of many of the other nobles, but true beauty casts it down. Much more flashiness, much more extra vengeance, more Basara, more plots and sacrifices, and all of the warrior houses may flourish, right? As we pretty much get a little bit of a flashback wherever Mima's father told her like, hey, your power is useful, so use it to its fullest for our general glory, right? As Mima just thinks like, hey, in service of my father's schemes, I use my powers to bury many opponents. About that time, I met him. Of course, thinking about Tokiyuki, right? He was weak and old-fashioned, but an upright and such a pure soul as I'd never seen in Kyo before, for he was my first love. And she just thinks like, hey, when I learned he was from the Hojo clan, I felt a little betrayed, but I was even more jealous. Revenge and restoring his clan are such both beautiful motives. I was covered in the grime of Kyo, but he had everything I lacked. His retainer even had some divine power like me. Think about Shizuku. as Mima just says, like, hey, I didn't want to lose to the spoiled brat to look down upon me, right? As we now see that Tokiyuki, who is, of course, in the water, is getting a lot of various arrows shot at him, as he just thinks, like, hey, Shizuku, Mima, like, you're going to kill each other, like, we can't be doing this. Kojiro is getting ready to jump into the ocean to be able to help Tokiyuki out of it, but Ginba sort of, like, holds him back, like, Kojiro, like, he's too far away, you will drown and you will kill yourself, like, you do not need to be doing this, right? And pretty much Kojiro's like, hey, but what about those warriors from the other families who are closer? Like, I doubt they'll succeed. And, like, if they keep their armor on, they'll sink, but they fall prey to the arrows they take up. Like, besides, no one would risk their life to save another family's boy. Like, this isn't going to be happening. But we now see an arrow is almost coming perfectly for Tokiyuki's head in this moment. And as all of this happens, we see that Yuki jumps down and sort of blocks the arrow with his back, as Tokiyuki's like, Yuki Dono, like, what are you doing this for, right? Yuki pretty much says, like, hey, I really hate back wounds because I can't see my blood gushing out. We pretty much see that his retainers pull him up out of the ship, and Tokiyuki's like, Yuki Dono, like, what are you doing this? Like, why would you come up to save me? And Yuki's like, hey, my wounds are very light, and never mind me. Tokiyuki Dono, you too have an undeniable character. You are kind-hearted and you love danger. So live according to your nature and let it thrill you. As presumably this may be a Yuki death. I don't really know if it quite matters, being that, I mean, it did seem like we were going to be around with Yuki for too much longer anyway, but sort of is what it is there. Tokiyuki then looks out to the ocean where Shizuku and Mima are just, like, battling it out completely. And Toki's like, hey, Yuki Dono, I'm gonna borrow this shield if you don't mind, right? And we pretty much see that Yuki's, like, gives, like, a little bit of, like, a thumb up, like, yeah, like, sure you can. Like, I don't know what that's gonna do for you, but whatever. And we see that Tokiyuki sort of puts it down into the water and sort of makes it like a makeshift snowboard. As Tokiyuki just thinks, like, hey, I refuse to lose them both. As we cut back over to where Shizuku is sort of up in the sky doing her whole ethereal being thing, and she just thinks, like, hey, thank you to all of you for all of your faith. Ayako, take care of Tokiyuki. I have no regrets, for I will disappear protecting Tokiyuki. As all of a sudden, a voice appears right behind Shizuku and just says, like, hey, is that really what you want to happen, Shizuku? As all of a sudden, we see that Yorishige is here. As we see that he's here, he is holding a pizza in his hand, presumably a pizza from a pizza box, and has a pizza cutter in his hand and is sort of cutting it up, which... There's a reason I love Yorishige, and that is because there's no other character who just appears holding a pizza box and a pizza cutter in this sort of joke fashion in this really, really serious scene, right? As Yorishige just says, like, hey, you suffer like a human and thus are more mortal than human at this time. And he's like, hey, furthermore, Tokiyuki-sama does not wish for you to be a god, Shizuku. As Tokiyuki, as Yorishige points over to where Tokiyuki is, sort of surfing on this shield over towards where the two of them are. As we pretty much see that Tokiyuki comes over and is like, hey, I have to stop Mima, then Shizuku won't have to end up disappearing. Like, I want to be with Shizuku, the human being, not with no Shizuku at all. And he just thinks, like, hey, Suomyojin, the Mikado, and you, all gods are people at the end of the day. And we can sort of see that Shizuku, being that she's in her godly form, is able to read some of these memories of Tokiyuki and this moment, right? At this point, Yorishige just says, like, hey, your young lord worships the god, but does not rely on them. He relied on a deity like me as a person and as a father, not as a god. He enjoys human company and solving problems through mortal means. As we see that Tokiyuki jumps through the air down to where Mima is, and is able to go through and sort of clasps Mima and sort of gives her a little bit of hug with his arms, right? As Tokiyuki just says, like, hey, I have you now, Mima, and Tokiyuki sort of looks over to where Mima's father, Sasuke Dono, is, and Tokiyuki sort of points over and says, like, hey, Sasuke Dono, I'm taking Mima. I can't leave her with a father like you. And Sasuke's like, hey, you only spent a few days together, yet you still try to save her? Like, warriors laugh. Like, I will laugh at your such childish decisions, right? But Tokiyuki just says, like, hey, I will take responsibility for this as a warrior. for I am going to marry her and spend my life making her happy. As at this point, we see that all of the characters are like, what is this? As Mima's like, huh? Sasuke's like, huh? Ayako and of course Shizuku are both like, huh? Also like, what is going on here? Because of course we know that Shizuku also has a massive crush on Tokiyuki, and I love that we see Yorishige is here in the background, and he is giving the best reaction of like Matsui's, like just like that very cheeky smile and like his hands up next to his face, and like, God, I love Yorishige. Yorishige is the only reason why I really like this chapter. I think it was fine. Yuki's whole jumping into the water to protect Tokiyuki, whatever, it sort of comes full circle on his character, but it's at the same time still like, okay then, alright, but sort of is what it is there. But really having Yorishige appear is really just so incredibly funny. Okay, I guess Tokiyuki's going to be marrying Mima now, whatever. I mean, also, I think we've sort of gotten on the series since it is set in 1338, then like, alright, yeah. Tokiyuki is going to marry almost every woman he meets. Like, yes, Ayako will be his bride. Shizuku will probably be his bride. Mima will be his bride. Like, that is how this is probably going to go down at the end of the day. Just being that that's how the time period would have presented itself, right? Granted, is that like the normal thing? No, but it's sort of how it is at this time period. And I'll give it to Matsui. He writes a very good time periodical piece. So, is what it is there, but Yorishige definitely made this chapter great. And with that, let's move on to the final chapter of today, Witch Watch chapter number 174. This chapter is titled Sneeze Explosion. So this week we have a relatively short gag chapter of Witch Watch, but I still think this is like one of the best Witch Watch chapters we've had in a long time, because I laughed almost constantly while reading this chapter, and I think this one's going to be a bit of a hard one to sort of recap in a sort of concise way, as I feel like the joke is best if you go through it and fully just read the chapter as it's presented. But pretty much the whole setup of this chapter is, understand it, Nico is a little under the weather right now, right? As she's like, Mori's like, hey, Nico, you need to go, like, in your room and sleep in your bed. And Nico's like, hey, I don't want to. It's going to be boring. And, like, hey, Bond's also gone off to play pachinko all alone, which is really the most typical Bond move I could see, is this drunk dragon lady just going off to just play pachinko. Like, yes, that is totally in her character for sure, right? And she's like, so I want to stay out here with everyone. I want to have some company, right? And Morita's like, all right, then I'll stay here with you, right? And as they're all talking with each other, they're just talking about, like, Nico's various spells and everything, and, like, what if being under the weather knocks her spells all out of whack, so she won't be able to focus and train as much on them. And Kanji says, like, oh yeah, I can totally see that. As Nico sort of just reels back and suddenly just sneezes all of a sudden. And as she sneezes, Khan's shirt flies off and just rips off in a bunch of these various different directions, right? And all the other guys in Yotogi household are like, hey, what the heck's going on here? Like, what actually happened to you, right? And Khan's like, what the heck? All of a sudden, I felt this weirdly tingly, and like this, like, what just happened? Did anybody else see what happened here? As Miharu's like, hey, I did, like, your t-shirt just spontaneously, like, shredded itself. Like, that's so weird, right? And the Kanji's like, yeah, like, that's, like, holy crap, that's super weird. And Morito's like, alright, Kanji, you've clearly done way too much weight training lately. Like, you're almost looking like a One Punch Man character, right? They specifically call out Kinshiro. I don't know what that reference is specifically from. It may be from JoJo's, or it may be from One Punch Man. I'm not 100% sure where that joke comes from, but I still sort of like the image where Kanji's, like, bulking up really big and, like, he just fucks his muscles and the shirt just shreds, which, as we know, is not Kanji whatsoever, right? And Kanji's like, hey, still, why the heck did my shirt just explode like that? Like, it really shocked the hell out of me, right? I thought I was dying for a second. As all of a sudden, Keigo's like, hey, I mean, it was pretty shocking to watch, too, like, very weird. And Miharu just says, yeah, like, why did it happen? And at this point, Nico sneezes again, and now Miharu's shirt completely breaks off of him, right? And everyone's like, again, like, what just happened? And Miharu's like, yeah, why is it me this time? Like, what the heck's going on here? And Kanji's like, yeah, I mean, you're telling us, like, what's up with all this crazy crap going on? Miharu pretty much says, like, hey, like, my shirt's been done to bits, like, all my precious ribbons and everything, like, what's going on? I'm, like, naked from the waist up. Keigo makes it up like, hey, come think of it, this is probably the first time that we've seen you bare-chested, Miharu. And hearing this, Miharu just says, like, or Keigo just says, like, hey, you've never come to public baths with us. Also, you're always really careful not to let us see you undressed. And Miharu then just sort of acts like a little bit of a twinking away, like, oh, but now that you're left like that, and he's like, guys, please don't stare at me, and like covers up his torso with his arms a little bit, and everybody's like, come on, dude, why are you acting so sexy like this? But at this point, Morito looks over to Kan, and he's like, hey, Kanchi, why is your t-shirt now fixed? And Kanchi's like, oh, well, what in the world? And they all realize, okay, this must be some sort of magic, and like, yeah, this definitely has Nico's fingerprints all over this, like, what's going on here? And it's like, well, but she is asleep right now, so a little confused to what this sort of means, all things considered. They pretty much explain, like, hey, it's probably a spell, but it's probably, being ill is causing it to misfire in some sort of way. And Miharu's like, so are you kidding me? Are you saying it's entirely possible that another one of us will get our clothes shredded? And like, well, it honestly doesn't matter. It all seems to get fixed at the end of the day. Kanji then notes that his shirt is a little bit messed up after it gets repaired, so it's not really getting repaired in really the best way, so it isn't working quite right, which means Nico being ill definitely has something to do with this spell not firing correctly, right? And like, well, it can't be just some random rhyme or reason. There has to be some way that this spell actually is working and triggering, and Keigo pretty much points out, like, right, her sneezes, that's definitely what triggers it, and they're like, all right, that makes sense. And Nico starts to sneeze again as Keigo just starts talking like, hey, like, crap, here comes, everybody brace yourself for an explosion. Nico sneezes and Keigo's shirt also rips off and completely flies off him as Miharu's shirt comes back on and sort of reattaches itself together over his torso, right? And like, oh crap, like what happened? And Keigo's like, damn it, like that spell totally freaked the fuck out of me. Hey guys, post-production Glowplasma 231 here. I just need to quickly say, sorry for what you're about to hear if you continue to listen to this section of the Witch Watch chapter review here. My voice was getting like very, very like hoarse, and like I need to drink more water, even though I was drinking like water every single swig. It's a byproduct of recording a video that's literally 2 hours long for such an extended period of time. So the rest of this section will sound not great, arguably, but if you cannot bear how this Witch Watch section sounds, there's of course the chapters and down in the description. You can just go click on, or on like the YouTube video itself, or if you're listening to this on like Spotify or any of the other places this podcast goes up, there are ways you can figure out where the Witch Watch chapter section ends. Good chapter though, so back on with the review. Again, sorry about how my voice sounds here. It's just one of those byproducts of, yeah, this video is very, very long. But Kanji's like, alright, well that proves your theory. We all now know how this spell sort of works. But then thinking about all of this, Kan just says like, hey, not only that, but we know that there was an order so far. So it was like Keigo, Miharu, and then me. Or no, it was me, Keigo, and then Miharu. Or no, me, Miharu, and then Keigo. Sorry, I've been recording this video for so long, like my throat is like completely through and like my brain is almost fried also. But they're sort of talking about all of this stuff, right? And Morito's like, hell no, this shirt is vintage and old, and it wasn't cheap for sure. Like, even if it does get repaired, a wonky seems to ruin the entire thing. As a little bit of jokes, like Kan is like, hey, I thought you said signs of repair and all of that were a little bit cute and all of that, right? And Morito's like, come on, dude, you know that this repair is magical, it is not natural. And he's like, all right, I'm out of here. And as he starts to leave the room, all of a sudden, Keigo's like, hey, come on, didn't you tell Nico you'd stay with her, so stay in the room with all of us. Nico sneezes again, and this time, Kanchi's shirt breaks off him along with his pants, right? And like, it hit you again, like, what's going on here? Like, it wasn't supposed to be my turn, like, screw all of this. As we pretty much learn the flow of the spell. Pretty much this spell works as whenever Nico sneezes, the last person to talk gets their clothes exploded off of them, right? We pretty much learn that the amount of clothes that come off of the character is the amount of times that the spell has triggered on them so far. Another sneeze happens and Keigo gets hit this time, which means that his left sock also disappears, right? So they sort of put together, so like, right, first time your shirt disappears, then your left sock, then your right sock, then your pants, which means after that, your underwear and stuff go next. But because Kanchi is barefoot, the spell skipped past the socks and went straight towards his shorts, breaking those off, right? Everybody's like, okay, well, and I really love one of the comments here of like, I'm pretty sure it's Keigo, like, hey bro, like, of all the things you use your mighty powers of observations for, like, come on now, right? But we see Keigo walk over to a chair in the room, and he's like, all right, well, thank God I had a spare t-shirt lying around, like, now that we know the rules, like, it seems like next time that Akane gets hit, it won't be really good, so it won't be great. As all of this happens, we see all the other guys are remaining silent. And Keigo's like, oh crap. He's like, right, the spell's going to target me next time she sneezes then, right? He's like, come on guys, say something, like, damn it, like, come on, don't tell me you aren't going to, like, hang me out to dry, like, this isn't right, like, what are you guys doing here? Like, he's like, at this rate, I will get hit next. And at this point, Momochi enters the Otogi household, as we see that she says, like, alright guys, I heard Nico wasn't feeling under the weather a little bit, so I brought a few things to sort of ease her cold. Well, hearing all of this, Keigo's like, holy crap, this is bad, like, you showed up at the worst possible time, Momochi. And Momochi's like, oh, look at Nico, she's looking all nice and cute napping here. As Keigo sort of just starts thinking, like, hey, at this rate, if Nico sneezes again, Momochi's blast will explode, revealing that glorious bust for everybody in the room to see. And Keigo just thinks like, hey, but is that really the right thing to do in this situation? Like, I know the spell's coming, so if I stay quiet, wouldn't that just, like, be on the equal level of, like, peeping at Momochi? Like, that's not good at all, right? And he was like, alright, hey, Boruto's totally, like, clammed up, so, like, I can't say I'm surprised, like, he loves his vintage wear too much. Miharu's silent too, given how much he, like, doesn't like being undressed, it makes sense. And Kanchi is definitely grinning like an idiot. Like, he totally wants to see Momochi's shirt explode, right? And Keigo's just like, hey, is it just me? Am I the only one who can end up saving Momochi here? Let's say I speak up. It'll be the third time, so I'll lose a shirt, a sock, and both of my socks, right? But it may be that the second hit in a row, so I'm already missing a sock, which means I'll lose my shirt, my other sock, and my pants. I'd just be stuck in my boxers in front of Momochi. He's like, no, wait. This is a fresh shirt I actually just put on after last hit. So will the spell count this shirt as being the first object, or will it be the last object, and I'll be stark naked in front of everybody, right? And he's like, crap, what do I do here? As Nico starts to get ready to sneeze, like, she's like, ah, choo. But before she can finish it, he's like, oh no, here it comes. And Momochi spoke last, and he's like, I'm the only one who can save her. Say something, Keigo, like, sacrifice yourself for the greater good, like, a lower body in public, like, don't be doing this, like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. He's like, what do I do here? But as all this happens, we suddenly see that Kanchi just says, alright, I sacrifice. As, of course, Nico then finishes her sneeze, as Kanchi has 3 articles of clothing exploded off of him, which, of course, includes his boxers, so he has ended up on the ground completely stark naked. Keigo's like, Kanchi, why did you do this, right? And Kanchi's like, hey, I thought I was the only one who could end up saving her, and I love how Keigo's like, bro, I'm totally sorry, Kanchi, I had you pegged in the totally wrong direction, I'm sorry for what I just did to you, right? But then Momochi's like, hey, save me, like, save me from what? We didn't see that Nico sort of wakes up a little bit, and everybody's like, hey, Nico, you're awake, right? And she says, like, hey, I feel a lot better after my nap. And she gets up, and she sort of sees that Kanchi's totally naked, and everyone's like, hey, Nico, don't look over here. And the final punchline to this joke is just Nico saying, like, hey, Kanchi, you're going to catch a cold if you're dressing like that, right? And everybody's like, come on, I don't want to hear that from you. Because, of course, she did not know what just happened and went on with all of this stuff going on here. This chapter was incredibly hilarious. I love sort of like the whole mental games going on here. I love the joke of sneezing and then exploding clothing. It's really, really funny. But at the end of the day, great gag, and I love seeing Keigo's whole thing. And, of course, Kanchi's all-sacrifice was incredibly hilarious. But with that, that is all of the chapters this week, so now it's time to go and rank them all. Alright, and we are back. That is about a 20-minute break between this segment and the Witch Watch segment. I don't know if you guys could tell there, but during that Witch Watch segment, my voice, like, really was starting to give out of me, so I, like, need to take a break, drink a lot more water than I was drinking, even though, like, in between all of these chapters, I've taken a nice big, like, I probably drinking, like, 4 water bottles during the recording of this video, just because, like, my voice is so scratchy by the end of it, but sort of is what it is. With that, it is finally time to rank all the chapters from worst to best, so let me, open up my recording setup. So we're going to record my screen, and 1, 2, 3. We are going to take Shonen Jump chapters, and alrighty, I think we are now good. Alright, so like I said, we have 16 chapters to talk about this week. As we see right here, we are doing with issue number 45 of 2022. Let's move it over here so there's less like space over there. Alright, so as far as the best chapters this week, as I said, the best chapter this week was Akane-banashi. It was a really incredible chapter, all things considered. So Akane-banashi, if I could spell. I don't know. Whenever I record these videos, I always feel like my spelling gets really, really bad all of a sudden. And then, of course, next is Blue Box. Like, no like consideration there. And then I already know what's next since I've thought about this a lot. It's Ruri Dragon. I absolutely loved Dragon. I absolutely loved that chapter. I would click to it up here, but like, I'm sorry, I do not want to show panels here because like maybe I can like show like here, like yeah, this Ruri Dragon chapter was just absolutely amazing through and through. Ruri Dragon was really, really fun. With that, we're going to delete some of the other chapters off here, and we're going to go to the very bottom. What were the worst chapters this week? Obviously, those were Kill Blue. It was Astro Royale, definitely the least of the bad chapters. Hakutaku, not the best chapter we had, and I think those are really, and I think Shinobi Undercover will be coming after those, so we're going to put Kill Blue on the bottom, because it's like, come on. Hakutaku, as you see, I already added down here that Hakutaku is being removed, just because, like, yeah, it's not the best. I think next is going to be Shinobi Undercover, and just above that, we're going to put Astro Royale. So, alright, so we're getting a few more of these series knocked out of here. Hakutaku, Astro Royale. We're going to like just copy and paste these two up here. Ichi the Witch, Shinobi Undercover, we got rid of that. Kill Blue. Alright, so as far as the rest of these chapters go, did I use all of these already? No, okay. Here's what we have left. Undead Unluck was also really, really good. Hunter x Hunter, I did enjoy it, though I don't remember everything going on in there. I think next actually has to be Ichi the Witch. Kagurabachi. It's like, what am I kidding myself? Kagurabachi. That chapter was just so cool, and like that final moment of where Cheer's like, hey, here he go, cut the BS. It's simply amazing. Ichi the Witch is up next. It's in our great chapter through and through. Witch Watch I'm going to put next just because I thought that gag was so incredibly funny. I think towards bomb, we're going to have to put OT X-Row Kiyoshi is like, it was okay, but it wasn't like the best thing I've ever read. Above that, we're going to put Elusive Samurai. Put that right there, which means we've got left with Undead Unluck, One Piece, Hunter x Hunter, and Hima-Ten. Undead Unluck is going to be coming next, because I just thought that was also just Unluck, a great chapter, followed by Hima-Ten, just solid through and through. Then we have One Piece and Hunter x Hunter. I think these were very comparable as, like, fun chapters, but I'm going to have to put One Piece ahead, just because I don't really remember everything about Hunter x Hunter, but Hunter, Hunterx, Hunter, there we go. And yeah, that's all of the chapters ranked this week. As far as the character of the week goes, Akane-banashi, I don't really think Shiguma needs to be picked, being like, that was a big moment, but it wasn't like the whole big, like, end-all, be-all. Blue Box, like, yes, I want to murder Saki with my bare hands. Like, I want to take her and I want to strangle her and cuss her out for what she's done to kill Naomi's relationship, but is what it is there. Ruri Dragon also very good. Kagurabachi, I don't think there's a great character from Kagurabachi. I really think as we move down this list, I think I'm going to have to give it to Julia from Undead Unluck. It just, I really loved her moment there at the very end. Like, all right, I want to find this out for myself. I want to go and I'm going to go through, I'm going to get these memories from Apocalypse. Everybody's believing in me, and I want to feel these feelings again like I did in the previous loop and uncover injustice. Really, really cool moment, all things considered. But yeah, that's everything ranked this week. As you guys see here again, top chapter was Akane-banashi, followed by Blue Box and Ruri Dragon, Kagurabachi, Ichi the Witch, Witch Watch, Undead Unluck, Hima-Ten, One Piece, Hunter x Hunter, Elusive Samurai, Ultimate Exorcist, Kiyoshi, Astro Royale, Shinobi Undercover, Hakutaku, and Kill Blue. With that, we are just going to come here and we are going to stop sharing the screen. So let's pause the recording from doing all this. We're going to save it and edit it for later whenever all of that sort of deal goes on. But thank you guys so very much for watching this video on Weekly Shonen Jump issue number 45 of 2024. I know this is a long one. I think it's probably 3 hours. Maybe it may be closer to like 3 hours or 2 hours and 40 by the time I get it all recorded and edited done. But this has been a long one. Thank you guys for sticking it out with me. And I'll be back sometimes later to talk about some more issues of Weekly Shonen Jump. Probably don't count on it for issue 46 of 2024, but I think Ruri Dragon's back in issue 47, so if there's a Ruri Dragon chapter, I'm going to be talking about Jump that week, so just be prepared for that. But yeah, next time we won't be talking about Hakutaku. Maybe we'll see some excellent stuff happening in Akane-banashi. Who really knows? I don't really know how much theory crafting will be going on with all of these. Of course, I'll have the Kagurabachi chapter review up in a few days. And if you did like this video, as you've probably known, I do plenty of other anime or manga-related content on the channel. Go check out those in all of the various places. I'll have a few links down below in the description. Plenty of our Weekly Shonen Jump episodes. I don't know if you guys noticed, but I actually upload this series as a podcast under the name of Weekly Shonen Jump Talks or Issue Talks or something like that. I've recently changed the name of the podcast to make it not so confusing. But yeah, thank you guys so very much for watching. My voice is absolutely fried after all this time. And yeah, Julia was an amazing character, and that Akane-banashi moment this week was absolutely insane. Thank you guys so very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. This is going to be Glowplasma 231, signing out.